Okay, everybody, let's begin again.
I like handouts because then people leave with something.
I think handouts are good. I agree.
Joseph Stern is going to be talking about the prehistoric archaeology of a very important street in Rehavia in Jerusalem. So please.
Yeah, Randy.
Yeah. And
You
there's a
have a
handout.
handout, David?
No, we didn't get them here.
No, some people here didn't get a handout.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Actually, I saw it on mine.
So the great thing about these conferences, summer schools, is that we all work in our particular languages and niches. And then you come here and you hear all these papers and you discover that really the same topics come up. So universality and particularity, relation between language and metaphysics, grammar as a religious activity. These are all themes that have been coming up, and you've been writing this paper, this talk, and discover, oh, you're not alone. Our story begins in 1391. After years of incitement and anti-Jewish riots, a local outbreak in Seville quickly turned to mob-driven, uncontrollable pogroms that spread through Christian Spain. Whole communities were destroyed. According to Chaim Beinart, and this historian here, a third of Spanish Jews refused to surrender their religion, instead martyred themselves like Kiddush Hashem to sanctify the name of God. A third were baptized, and a third survived mainly by fleeing to other countries. In addition to those who were forcibly converted, many rabbis, state community leaders, and scholars converted voluntarily out of conviction. But both those who converted under coercion and those who converted of their own free will suffered an ambivalence. These are what are commonly known as conversos, and the Christians, and the pejorative Moranos. They suffered an ambivalent fate. By converting, they cut themselves off from the Jewish community, but they, on the other hand, they weren't accepted as full members of Christian society. So they constituted a marginal subworld between Jews and Spanish Christians, and many privately or secretly continued to practice Judaism as they could, often at great risk. And the consequences of this conversion, mass conversion, really ensued over the following 200 or 300 years, radically transformed Judaism. So it made this one of the greatest traumas and crises in the history of the Jews. And I'd say that to this day, nobody really understands what happened. Okay, now this is number one in the handout, biographical background. Among the forced converts to Christianity in 1391, there's one remarkable enigmatic thinker who stands out, and that's Profyat Duran. He was born in Perpignan, Catalonia in the 1350s, received a solid but not exceptional rabbinic, that is Talmudic, training, education, but he achieved an extremely impressive mastery of the Hebrew Bible. He was also well-grounded in medieval Jewish and Arabic. These were all translated by then into Hebrew, philosophers in science, okay, especially Maimonides and his commentators, and he knew some contemporary Christian scholastic philosophy and science. When he was still in his 20s or 30s, he wrote a commentary on Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed, and this remains one of 4 standard commentaries that are printed to this day in the standard translation, Hebrew translation by Ibn Tibbon, who's Maimonides' great medieval translator. And on the whole, he's something of a critical Maimonidean. We can talk about that more in the questions and answers. I'm not going to talk a great deal about that. Duran wrote exclusively in Hebrew, but he knew vernacular Catalan, and he seems to have been reasonably competent in Latin. He was trained officially as in medicine, but his intellectual interests by choice lay in mathematics, the calendar, astronomy, astrology, and Hebrew grammar, and he left substantial writings on all of these subjects. He was also a very competent and active teacher of the sciences, and he left us notebooks from his teaching circles, which are one of our few windows into the settings in which medieval Jews were able to study science and philosophy outside the cathedral schools and universities from which they were obviously borrowed. Now, the exact circumstances of Duran's forced conversion in 1391 aren't known, but despite many opportunities to return to the fold, including sojourns in Italy where he engaged in the book trade, selling Jewish Hebrew books to Jews, all right, he nonetheless chose to remain a Christian in public until his death in Valencia in 1433. Now, what makes Duran remarkable, indeed unique among conversos, who generally left little or no writing, period, is that he produced a whole body of writings, and I listed the works on a handout, that were written in Hebrew while he was a converso. His very choice of Hebrew for all these writings was itself obviously provocative, maybe it was meant as a declaration of war. And two among these compositions are openly polemical. They include some of the most virulent attacks on Christianity by a Jew in the Middle Ages. But Duran's most important treatise and his most original attack on Christianity is by way of critiquing the languages of the church, Greek and Latin. And he does this, all right, in his Hebrew grammar of biblical Hebrew, the aseh Efod, that's on the handout, which is a speculative grammar in the style developed in the 13th, 14th century by Latin grammarians. By speculative, I mean that its goal is neither descriptive nor prescriptive, but explanatory or scientific. When Aristotle's posterior analytics was recovered in the 12th century, grammarians began to transform the study of science, the study of grammar, into a science. They constructed general grammars, focused on universal features of language, gave causal explanations for the linguistic universals, and showed how linguistic notions can be explained by metaphysics. Okay? And this, we heard about that this morning with Uri, and this is a revival of that. Okay? And Duran's grammar falls in this speculative tradition. The grammar proper is prefaced by an equally original introduction on different models of Jewish chachma, wisdom. You could translate that maybe as spirituality in this context, which includes his own conception of chachmat Torah, the wisdom of the Torah. Unfortunately, the aseh Efod has suffered a terrible fate. Its introduction has been fairly widely studied by intellectual and cultural historians who appear to assume that there's no need for a scholar to acquaint yourself with the grammar to which an introduction is an introduction. So they study the grammar, but they study the introduction, but ignore the grammar proper. The very few linguists or historians of Hebrew grammar who've looked at the grammar, and I know of 4 living people who've done this, skip the introduction. So almost no one reads both the introduction and the grammar. Hence, their relation is entirely ignored. One incidental lesson I'm going to try to convince you of today is that you can't really understand one without the other. Now, when I worked on the aseh Efod, and I worked in this at some length a few years ago, apart from my interest in it intrinsically as a speculative grammar, and I think it's the most important piece in the philosophy of language written in medieval Jewish thought after Maimonides, I was mainly interested in Duran's original and radical reconceptualization of Judaism as a reaction to and a reflection of the crisis that the Spanish Jews underwent in the 1390s. I wasn't thinking explicitly of grammar wars. So in response to David and Yigal's invitation to participate in this summer school, I've been trying to reapproach the aseh Efod from this other direction. It's absolutely clear that Duran is fighting a war. In fact, I'm going to argue a war on two fronts, one against Christianity and the other against Rabbinic Judaism, the rabbis. What's much less clear is whether either of his two opponents, enemies, were fighting back. Indeed, whether they even knew of Duran's aggressive critiques, this war on them. Okay? So Duran's war is not only a one-man show, it's one-sided. He's more like a lone wolf or a guerrilla warrior fighter. Now, there's a related question which many scholars have raised about how Duran, as a new Christian, could get away with writing overt anti-Christian polemics without retaliation by the Inquisition. And this includes the Efod, which is, as a grammar in Hebrew, exalting the Hebrew language as explicitly opposed to Greek and Latin, the languages of the church. Now, this is a very good question, but I'm not going to talk about it in the talk itself. If anybody wants to talk about it in the Q&A, fine. But there's another question to which I will return at the end, and that's whether and how Christianity might have influenced Duran's own reconception of Judaism. And if it did, that might have been Christianity's ultimate counteroffense, right? Reaction to Duran. Before I turn to the grammar and introduction, I want to say a word about Duran's names, and especially the name Efod or Efodi, which has everything to do with his war against Christianity. His Hebrew name, and this is on the handout, was Isaac Yitzchak ben Moshe ben Moses Hanlevi, so quasi priestly family. Profyat Duran was his given Spanish name. Duran is not really a family name. In Catalonia, firstborn sons were given the name of their father in reverse order. So his father's name was Duran Profyat. He simply switched it. When he was baptized, he took on the new Christian name, Honoratus de bona fide. But it was also a common practice for authors to sign glosses in the margins of a manuscript with an abbreviation of one's name preceded by the letter Aleph for Amar, he said. Okay, so Duran would have signed his own glosses with the acronym of Amar Profyat Duran, so said Profyat Duran, which are the letters Aleph, Pei, Daled, which spell out in Hebrew the word Efod, which is the Hebrew word for a belt-like garment worn by the high priest in the temple, so a name that recalls ancient Jewish nobility and glory. And Duran already uses this acronym in his early writings, like the one on the commentary in the guide, and on other pre-conversion works. But the term acquires a deeper valence when he continues to use it after his forced conversion. In the eulogy that he composed in 1393 for a rabbinic leader who perished in the aftermath of the 1391 riots, and this is number 1 in your handout, Duran begins by alluding to his own forced conversion, the appearance that he's forsaken the religion of his fathers, and to the dichotomous divided life he has to live now, in which his outward behavior can mirror his inner states, all right, and the need to hide his own identity. Let me just read the parts that's in bold in 1. In the secret, Duran speaking in the third person about himself, his soul is bound up to yours, weeps, for is he not of another faith? Strange is his deed, and alien his worship. Your brother, the Levite, whose song has been spoiled, this is his name forever, and his memorial, Efod. I'm not going to go into, there's a lot of imagery in the first half of this passage, but Duran here, speaking of himself in the third person, calls his new faith alien worship, in Hebrew, nachriya avodato, which he just juxtaposes with another Hebrew phrase, aseh zar, okay, alien his worship, okay, which plays on the term avodah zarah, which is the rabbinic term for idolatry. In other words, he's saying his new faith, Christianity, is idolatry. And here, Duran is following Maimonides, who claims that Christianity, in contrast to Islam, is idolatrous because it conceives of God as a bodily unit. Yet, despite the sin of idolatry, Duran emphasizes that he's still a brother. This is the conflict, a Levite, all right, whose name finally is Efod. Now, when he uses Efod here, he's not just signing off with the acronym for Amar said Profyat Duran. The Efod, I said, was a bell-like garment that the high priest wore in the temple. Now, each priestly garment was also said to have its own respective function to atone for a particular kind of sin. The Efod was to atone specifically for the sin of idolatry. So by signing himself Efod or Efodi, Duran is also expressing his own contrition and his intention that his signed compositions, like the aseh Efod, atone for his sin of idolatry by converting to Christianity. He uses, in other words, the name Efod, the name of the priestly garment, to express his own inner state. Let me just say here, if you want to read an extremely good, we now have an extremely good intellectual biography of Duran by Mark Kozadai. I'll pass it around, people can look at it. I'll pass around, here's the Hebrew, for those of you who know Hebrew, the actual grammar, the aseh. You can just get, you can feel it. Okay, now with this background, okay, let me turn now to the introduction to the aseh. It falls into three parts. The first part, Duran begins with the traditional distinction between this worldly happiness and the ultimate and infinitely greater happiness of the immortal afterlife. Then he says, in two, the way to attain the happiness of otherworldly immortality is to keep the divine Torah, Shmirat Torah, and to perform its commandments. Now, the way the rabbis traditionally understand that formula, the two phrases, keeping the Torah and doing the commandments, mean that one keeps the Torah by doing the commandments, by performing the mitzvot. And that expresses the core rabbinic theme that the essence of the Torah are its commanded actions, the mitzvot, the Mosaic commandments, and that its wisdom, the study of the Torah, consists in knowledge of halakha, the scriptural and rabbinic laws that govern those actions, rituals, the temple code, purity, impurity, and so on. That knowledge of how to act is how you get into the afterlife, achieve immortality. Duran turns this thesis on its head. And this is number 3, and I'll just read the bold. Performance of a commandment devoid of a proper intention or understanding of its purposeful wisdom plays no part in achieving either of the ends of the Torah, this worldly happiness, and especially the ultimate end. So for Duran, the performance of the commandments, actions, without the proper intention, without knowing the wisdom behind them, is simply worthless. And even with the right intention and knowledge, those actions are at most a means of achieving this worldly happiness, okay? Ultimate perfection and eternal happiness, the result of keeping the Torah, is a function exclusively, and we'll see this in the next passage, exclusively of apprehending the wisdom of the Torah, achieving a certain perfection of the intellect, of the mind, without performing any action at all. As Katsadoy argues, this is exactly what one would expect of a converso who longs to fulfill the Torah, but cannot outwardly and publicly enact the commandments. But more profoundly, what emerges from Duran's argument is a radically new form of Judaism, or more generally of religion, focused on a purely internalized religious state whose inner subject concerns himself exclusively with wisdom, the right beliefs, right intentions, no external performance. The second part of the introduction turns to the question, well, what then is the wisdom of the Torah? And he reviews what were then the 3 canonical answers to that question, conceptions of that wisdom, the Talmudic, the philosophical, and the Kabbalistic, and he rejects each of them. I'm not going to go into the details for reasons of time, but after criticizing them, Duran offers his own view. And this is number 4 on the handout. It's a long passage, I'm going to read it all. The wisdom of the Torah is this written Torah itself. So the Hebrew Bibles, we know it, material, the published Hebrew Bible. And the constant occupation with it, keeping it in the heart, contemplation of it, keeping its presence in the memory, not turning one's thought from it toward any other thing during the time one is occupied with it. All this directs a man straight to the ultimate eternal felicity. That's what I said a minute ago, right? Simply contemplation, this internalization of the wisdom is how you achieve otherworldly happiness without any action. And this is the cause not only of eternal felicity alone, but also the imagined. This worldly happiness gives the skula, and I'll leave that term untranslated for a minute, that inheres in this divine Torah. If one meditates on the Torah constantly, he'll have good success, meaning the achievement of eternal happiness, which is entirely intellectual. And the wonder is that it says, and you shall meditate therein for meditation alone, namely reading it, is something that brings one to this skula, and all the more so if there is, along with this, a good understanding of what's meant by it, and an apprehension of its depths and secrets. In order to draw down the divine emanation, so that divine providence should attach to the nation through the skula, attached to the statements of the Torah, it commands that those words should be phylacteries between the eyes. These are these little boxes containing scrolls and passages from the Hebrew Bible, right? And to bind them on the arms and to inscribe them in the zuzot. These are on the doorposts, the scrolls on the doorposts. Okay, and all this involves what is written in the Torah and not what is passed on by tradition, which is the oral Torah. I'll come back to that phrase in a minute. These matters concern not only the divine Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, but also all the holy books included in the prophets and writings to which the skula attaches. And that's to say that their medium should not change to another language. They must remain in the language uniquely dedicated to them, namely the holy language, Lashon HaKodesh, Hebrew, biblical Hebrew. For this reason, a Torah scroll composed in another language is invalid. Okay, I want to concentrate on 2 points in this rich passage. The first is the central role of memorization and meditation on specifically the written Torah, the Hebrew Bible, as modes of internalization of the wisdom of the Torah. So this is a state of mind, again, without the performance of any external action. You have to constantly reflect on, have present conscious thought, attend to the memorized text of the very words of Scripture, not just its literal content, but its original Hebrew language. The second theme, okay, is what Duran calls the skula that inheres in this divine Torah, in virtue of which its internalization, memorization, has the power to work its providential wonders. And as I said, I've left that term skula untranslated. In the Hebrew Bible, the term refers to something precious, dear, uniquely treasured. The people of Israel are said to be Am Skula, God's precious people, okay, treasured people, and that endows it with a kind of sanctified resonance. Within medieval Jewish thought, there were 2 different uses of the term skula. If you look on the handout on number 3, 5a, let me just read what I put in the handout. Within the Jewish Aristotelian Maimonidean tradition, the philosophical tradition, the Hebrew skula translates the Arabic chasa, which translates the Greek idiom, in Latin proprium, which is a property which is true of all members of a species, but not part of its definition or its essence, the essence of the species. So Aristotle's standard example for humanity, the species of humanity, is risibility, the ability to laugh, but other proprietary humans are being bipedal or erect in posture. And Maimonides says that speaking with the tongue, all right, is a proprium of a human being. So a skula is a property that's true of all members of a species, but not necessarily true of them. So because it's true of everyone in the species, it's more than a simple accident, a property that some people may or might not have, but at the same time, it's less than essential, than defining, because it's not necessary. So you could say that skulot, that's the plural, particularize or individuate a species, but they don't define it. And because they fall between the cracks of a mere attribute, something having gray hair or black hair or red hair, right, that you just have or might have or not have, all right, and being an essence, which is necessarily true, and falling between the cracks for reasons that we really can't explain, all right, these propria, already skulot, acquire a connotation of being somewhat mysterious, not fully understood, inexplicable in a way. The second notion of skuma is within medieval medicine. And there it's translated, I think best, this is Kazagoy's suggestion, as an occult virtue. That's a power of certain drugs, stones, herbs, plants, and words, especially divine words, that can't be explained by the rational principles of Greco-Arabic medicine. So when a cure works, all right, but can't be explained by underlying principles, right, then the physician, the doctor, posits emergent forms in the cures themselves, in those stones, rocks, all right, words, all right, that inhere in whole substances, but are not a function of their parts. According to Maimonides, the physician, these properties he writes that the physicians call skulot, in principle ought to be forbidden. This is something like magic or superstition. Okay? They can't be explained by scientific theory or by reason. But he nonetheless permits them because they've been validated by experience. So the term acquires this sense of an occult virtue, this unknown power, okay? And that spreads from medicine then into Latin magic and astrology, and then into Christian theology, and then finally back into Jewish thought and Jewish theology. So in sum, there are two distinct ideas of skuma that run through medieval Jewish philosophy and science, although both of them, as I've mentioned, appeal to its unexplained and not fully understood character or power. Which of these two is Duran's in passage number 4? Well, the historians who read the introduction to the Efod treat the skuma as a quasi-magical, super rational occult power or faculty, like in 5b. In other words, the medical astrological notion. They describe the skuma that attaches to the written power as somatic rather than cognitive. It's an amuletic source of special power that somehow can draw down emanational effects. This makes the written Torah, to which the skuma attaches, more like a material artifact, an object, a material object, okay, rather than an object of knowledge or understanding. And as evidence, the historians cite Duran's references, which he mentioned in 4, to skulot of ritual objects like the tefillin or mezuzah, and the fact that elsewhere he compares meditation on and reading the Torah to the incantation of verses from the written Torah, which, especially from Psalms, there's a magical practice called shimush tehillim, which the historians take to be enunciation of words, rude words without comprehension or understanding. So the skuma simply works by the force of sounding out uninterpreted words and marks. So that's how the historians understand it. I wouldn't absolutely exclude, okay, this magical, amuletic, or supernatural conception of skuma. In a moment, Duran does talk that way. But the idea, especially its exclusive interpretation, has very serious problems and includes misreadings of the text. For example, if you look back at 4, when Duran compares the skuma of the written Torah to that of phylacteries or the mezuzah in 4, it's not to show that they both have a somatic or amuletic character. His point is rather that the skuma of those ritual objects depend on the fact that they contain only scriptural verses and no rabbinic statements, no rabbinic oral Torah, right? And this is part of his war on Rabbinic Judaism. Nor does Duran suggest anywhere that I've seen that meditation or reading is without any comprehension or understanding. On the contrary, he says that his grammar explains scripture according to its linguistic meaning, which surely involves understanding. And where you would most expect to find examples of the skuma would be with the names of God, right? Magical, amuletic, objects, but there he doesn't mention the skuma at all. Okay? And most important, what the amuletic or somatic interpretation of skuma ignores is precisely the grammar of the aseh Efod. Certain powers or potencies of specific grammatical structures are said to be skuma. We'll see this in a minute. In particular, the reflexive construction, the binyan hipa'el. Okay? The reflexive construction has no magical or supernatural power. He said, I know it. Instead, what it seems is that Duran's use of the term skuma in the grammar is more like Newton's force of gravitation or Hume's ultimate causes. In other words, causal power or potency that's not fully understood at present, for which our evidence is empirical, but for which ultimately there ought to be a natural explanation. Now, in order to work out these ways in which biblical Hebrew has a skuma, the language of the written Torah, has a skuma more like the first sense of a propriety, let's turn to the grammar proper of the aseh Efod, and that'll lead us to Duran's two grammar wars against Christianity and the rabbis. So this is number 4. In broad strokes, the aseh Efod then is a speculative, that is explanatory grammar, which conceives of language as a system of significant and non-significant sounds structured into general word classes or categories. This is important. It's not concerned with individual words, all right, with word categories, all right, or classes of expressions. Its primary concern is with universal grammar, because features true of all languages, even if the only way to study them is via a particular language that exemplifies those universals. Now, for Duran, the one language that turns out that one language that exemplifies the linguistic universals turns out to be biblical Hebrew, and Hebrew as opposed to Greek and Latin, the languages of the church. 4, the grammar explains the linguistic facts by metaphysical notions. And we'll see an example of this in a moment, right, with the particles of speech, the parts of speech, all right, which are explained in terms of metaphysical types. And finally, what makes Hebrew the most perfect language and superior to the 2 languages of the church is that its grammatical features uniquely among all languages, and this is, of course, relative to his knowledge of languages. Okay. Hebrew alone transparently shows what's universally true of all languages, and therefore can serve as a transparent window through which we can see the metaphysical reality that explains the linguistic universal. So what makes Hebrew perfect and superior, this is similar to what the question Andy was raising when we saw this morning in Uri's story. Okay? What makes Hebrew perfect and superior now is a kind of universality that the church always claimed for itself as a universal religion, the religion for all peoples, and not just a religion like Judaism that's meant for one particular nation. Translated into linguistic terms, Duran makes biblical Hebrew, as opposed to Greek and Latin, the true exemplar of universal language, the language of all humanity. So all that's really necessary to complete Duran's story is identifying language and religion, all right? And we'll come back to that at the end to make the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, the true religion, universal religion. Now, in the style of other speculative grammars, the aseh Efod consists of a prologue, and this is also in the handout. It consists of a definition of language, then he gives a 4-fold Aristotelian causal explanation of language, an overview of the 3 parts of speech, the alphabet, phonetics, and he has a very detailed description of the organs of speech and speech production, which is very rare among Hebrew grammars. And finally, chapters on the decline of the Hebrew language and the current status of the science of language. And then the prologue is followed by chapters, and you can see that in the text that the original I passed around, on nouns, the verb system, particles, pronouns, word roots, and pronunciation. Let me just mention a couple particulars from the prologue. Employing Aristotle's four causes, Duran proposes that the final cause, the end, the themos of language, is both practical, communication to enable a political society, the existence of society, okay, and to enable the teaching, all right, that will bring one to intellectual perfection. So both practical and theoretical. The material cause of language is sound, and its formal cause, its essence, is its significance. So the basic unit of language, the meaningful word, the kol moreh in Hebrew, or vox significandi, is in Latin, is a homomorphic substance composed of matter, meaning sound, and form, or significance. But the most important cause for Duran is the efficient cause of language. In other words, who produced it. Maimonides, following Aristotle, had claimed that language is conventional, for which he meant that it was a human artifact, neither a natural product of biological capacities, nor an effect determined by natural forces, like astrological forces, celestial forces. For Duran, in contrast, language is both conventional and natural. What he means by conventional is that the language giver, whoever he was, imposed significance on the material sounds by an act of will and deliberate choice. So what characterizes the conventionality of language is that it was imposed, came about voluntarily. Who was this giver of language? Well, if languages have to be the product of will and deliberate choice, right, there are only two possible candidates, either God or Adam. Now, scripture, of course, suggests that it was Adam who gave the names to the animals, who originated language. That's how it's usually understood. But Duran argues that really, according to the verses, it wasn't a language that Adam originated. Adam only gave names, and he only gave them to the animals. But animals are only substances, and nominals and names and nouns themselves are only one part of a language, which also includes verbs and particles. And none of them are said by the Bible to have been given by Adam. Okay. So in other words, Duran is saying that a language is not one kind of word, right? It's a complex system of multiple interrelated categories of expressions, and there's no evidence that any single human ever could have originated it. In other words, the origins are a miracle. So if it's not a human that could have originated language, then only God could have been the efficient cause of language. Now, if God originated language as such, he also must have originated a particular first language. And that, unsurprisingly, Duran identifies with ancient biblical Hebrew. And I want to emphasize, by Hebrew, he always means biblical Hebrew, non-Mishnaic, Rabbinic, or medieval Hebrew, which Duran bemoans are all degenerate bastards of biblical Hebrew, intermarried, intermixed with foreign tongues due to rabbinic corruption and neglect. But what privileges biblical Hebrew as the divine language, as the best language, is not its spiritual character or its metaphysical perfection, or even the divine identity of its producer. What distinguishes it is that it's one, that is a pure language, not mixed with or corrupted by other languages. Because of its purity, we said earlier, biblical Hebrew can then function to uniquely, transparently exemplify the universal features of all languages. So what makes Hebrew best is not what distinguishes it from all other languages, but really shows what's universal to all languages. Okay, so let me now turn with that background to Duran's war against Christianity. Number 5. For reasons of time, I'm only going to talk about universals that are a function of what the medievals called significance, as opposed to what they call the supposition of individual terms. Supposition refers to the meaning or the reference of names in particular. Significance, on the other hand, is concerned with meaningfulness, with the intra-linguistic semantic relations between words qua members of grammatical categories that determine their possible co-occurrence within syntactic configurations, but with more general aspects of meaning that don't serve to determine a specific reference, like categorical features, like being a noun or a verb or preposition, particle, okay, tense, gender, agreement, case, and voice. Most of Duran's grammar is concerned with grammatical significance, not with supposition. Okay? And he also claims that significance is a kind of structure or mode that was imposed by God's free will, deliberative will. So these structures, the significance is also divine, conventional, and natural, because the significance is to be explained by metaphysics, real distinctions in the world. And let me give you 4 examples of this. A and B are 2 different metaphysical explanations for the 3 parts of speech. In other words, the grammatical categories in which the significance of word strings or phrases depends. Every word in every language belongs to one of the 3 parts of speech. Okay? So if you look in the handout, on the left-hand side, I gave the 3 parts of speech: nouns or nominals, shemot, verbs or action words, kalim, and particles, mimodatam, or kalim. That's his, he makes up a lot of his terminology. Nouns and verbs differ according to Aristotle, that nouns signify substances and abstraction from time. Verbs signify actions, okay, which Duran defines as the existence, which is neither the origination of an accident, or the reception of an accident property, okay, or the subsistence of a property in a substance at a definite time. So they're tense. This universal linguistic tripartite distinction between the 3 parts of speech, in turn, is to be explained by the metaphysical distinction between everything that exists, barim, all right, in the world. This on the right-hand side under A. The first 2 classes exist in the external world: substances, which are independent of one another entirely; accidents, which can only occur in a subject, all right, which are signified by nouns and verbs respectively, right? And the 3rd class are things that exist only in the mind, okay? And he explains these in number 6, intellectual notions that have no existence external to the mind, that are connections between propositions and between substances and accidents, and between modes and manners of these connections, as if they were the shared borders with which speech is composed. Like Christians, Latin grammatical category of syncategorematica, okay, Duran's particles have no autonomous significance. They become meaningful only in combination with other meaningful expressions in sentential or prepositional contexts. But Duran also has a second metaphysical explanation for the 3 parts of speech, and this is in B. The 3 parts correspond to 3 general classes of beings in our ontology. For nouns, it's the intelligible world that undergoes no motion, no change in time. For verbs, it's the world of eternal but moving substances, the celestial spheres. And for particles, which have no external significance, it's the sublunar world of generated and corrupted substances that lack all true being. They're in a constant state of becoming. Now, in particular, he argues, the noun corresponds to the unchanging intelligible world because the Hebrew noun undergoes no grammatical modification. It never changes case, though its case can vary with its use, its shimush, where it occurs in a sentence. For Duran, this is a transparent correspondence between the language, biblical Hebrew, and the metaphysics, the intelligible world. And it's unique to Hebrew and does not obtain in Latin and Greek, in which names do undergo grammatical modification of case. So all languages may have the 3 parts of speech, but only Hebrew transparently exemplifies the full metaphysical reality that lies behind them. If we take the skula, the special power of language, to be the metaphysical knowledge it reveals than biblical Hebrew, or the wisdom of the Torah that expresses, defeats Latin and Greek, the media of Christian wisdom. So that's one front in which he wins against the church. C is Duran's analysis of the Hebrew verb system. So in Hebrew, he derives full verbs in 3 stages. First is the name of an action, Shema Poel, or gerund, which Duran identifies with the morphological root of stem, the makor of the verb, which signifies a non-tense, infinitive, we say, action. If you want to produce a verb, a poel, from a root or action name, so then you add, you conjugate a past or future temporal, you conjugated it with a past or future temporal marker, and thereby tense it. Finally, more complex verbs are derived from the more basic ones by way of conjugation using a binyan. Binyan literally means building or structure or construction, and it refers to a morphological pattern or derivational class in the verb system. So if you look at if you look on the handout, most medieval and contemporary Hebrew grammarians distinguish 7 such binyanim constructions. So the standard medieval view is that the active is the pa'al, that's simple, PL, intensive, hifil, causative. Then there's a passive, nifal, the simple, pual, intensive, and hufal, causative. Then there's reflexive, hipael. But Duran argues that there are really only 6 such constructions. But he calls pa'al, PL, hifil, poel, which he makes up, okay, nifal, and hipael. And on closer analysis, what he's really saying is that there are 3 pairs of binyanim, pa'al and PL, one's light and one's intensive, nifal and hipael, and hifil and poel, because the members of each pair are very close in meaning. The difference between Duran's 6 binyanim account and the 7 binyanim theory is entirely due to his metaphysical assumptions that underlie his explanation of the linguistic data. And here are the metaphysical assumptions. They're on the handout. A verb signifies an action that moves or causes, changes, all right, the existence, that is the origination or the reception or the subsistence, all right, of an accident at a time in a substance, right? So it's the agent, okay? 2, all motion or causation then requires an agent. 3, the agent either will or won't be different from the patient, the substance in which the accident is caused to exist. 4, the agent will either be the proximate immediate cause or a remote cause mediated by an intermediate cause. And from that, you get the linguistic implication. The 2 simple binyanim, pa'al, light, and PL, intensive, signify actions where A, the agent is not identical to the patient, right? Okay, and where the agent is the immediate or proximate cause of the origination or subsistence of the accident. The 2 binyanim, hifil and poel, light and intensive, signify actions where the agent is not identical to the patient and where the agent is the remote cause of the accident in the patient, and the intermediate cause is the agent's instrument. And the last pair, nifal and hipael, light and intensive, right, signify actions where the agent is identical to the patient, one being, so it's reflexive, all right, and the agent is the proximate immediate cause. Now, what's conspicuously absent from this 6 binyanim typology is that there's no passive. And the reason is that for Duran, the difference between active and passive voice is not a metaphysical distinction, but merely a matter of shimush, of use, where the verb occurs and the nouns occur in the proposition or the sentence. In contrast, the differences manifest in the different binyanim or constructions, had morphological derivations, all right? The differences manifest in them in motion, change, causation, the substance accident relation are ontologically real and natural. So they reflect the metaphysics of motion and accidents and don't vary with use or occurrence. And because the 6 Hebrew binyamin transparently mirror the metaphysical reality, Duran once again argues that Hebrew is superior to all other languages, and especially Greek and Latin, the languages of the church. So a third battle won on another front of Duran's grammar rules.
What is poem? What is
What
is binyan poem?
is the intensive, right, of Pia, right? I'm sorry, Poel is of Hefil. Or, yeah, Hefil and Poel, it's the intensive form, all right, of the causative, okay? He makes this up. I mean, nobody else has the binyan Poel,
Yeah,
okay? But it reflects the metaphysics.
but is
You
there
can have a 5 binyan.
is there a linguistic reality that this?
Yeah, he gives
corresponds?
examples. You can look, I don't remember them, but yeah, he gives examples. D, all right, the fourth example, all right, are the 2 skumot of the binyan hitpael, reflexive construction that I mentioned earlier. As I said earlier, there's nothing magical or super rational about the reflexive construction. So its skuma must be a propriety, or a property true of all right, not just some, all right, like a mere accident, all right. So true of all or most reflexive constructions, but not part of its essence. The essence, what defines the hitpael, or that its agent, as we just said, are identical, the agent is identical to the patient, and that the causation is proximate or immediate. But in addition, Duran posits 2 kinds of skumot that are associated with or possessed by the construction. The first is that the hitpael always, or for the most part, signifies mental or psychological states or dispositions, or it signifies what's represented in speech. It never signifies the accident itself that occurs in the external world. So here are 2 examples. The little Roman I, the little I. The verse, and Adam and his wife hid themselves. That signifies that they sought or thought to hide themselves from God. In other words, your state of mind. It can't signify the impossible state of affairs in which a human hides himself from God. Okay. Likewise, in 2, one pretends to be rich, mitasher, and really has nothing. Another professes to be poor, miproshesh, and has much health and has much wealth. Okay, so one who pretends or verbally represents himself as being poor or wealthy, not what you actually are. Okay? The second kind of skuma of the reflexive is that it signifies intensified, persisting, strong accidents, effects, or impressions of actions that agents do to themselves. For example, in 3, and he mourned for his son, Vayitabel Abano. That means that Jacob mourned exceedingly, excessively to Joseph. He didn't just cry. In all these examples, Duran doesn't claim that the hitpael pattern always or exclusively carries one or the other of these properties. Instead, as you can see in 7, the hitpael, the reflexive, has the potential to be used in this, way. Just as risibility is a skuma for the human being, insofar he always has the potentiality for power to laugh, not these constantly actually laughing all the time. Okay, so what makes these 2 kinds of accidents, mental and intensified states, skumot, is that their powers or potentialities specific to the construction that individuate or particularize it, okay, but are not definitive or essential. So there's something not fully understood about them because they're more than accidents, mere, things that happen, might or might not, but they're yet not definitive. So there's something not fully understood, and Hebrew uniquely exemplifies this kind of metaphysical fact. So in sum, Duran's metaphysical explanation of all these linguistic features is, I think, remarkable, especially within the history of Hebrew grammar, on several counts. It's not the specific meanings of individual words, but the general meaning or significance of a word class or syntactic category or construction that's explained. By examining the interaction among different syntactic features, often packed into one word, he focuses on the semantics not only of signification, but of consignification. And although he doesn't make it explicit, his analysis comes close to viewing words as a bundle or complex of features, right, that determine which words can combine with which other words and establish dependencies among co-occurring elements. And finally, as I said, repeated, this relation between language and metaphysics is exemplified by Hebrew and not by Greek and Latin, and that's the battleground on which his war against Christianity is fought. So in the last part, I want to turn now to his attack on Rabbinic Judaism. This is number 6 on the handout. And this turns on to go back to his conception of the wisdom of the Torah, which you'll recall consists in internalizing or constantly have in mind the Hebrew Bible or written Torah, and written Torah as opposed to the oral Torah, the traditions already of the rabbis that were supposedly originally communicated, transmitted orally. So the question is, what is it to have the written Torah in mind? Is having the written Torah in mind like holding an amulet in your hand, or is it being in a certain cognitive state? And the answer to this question turns out 2 ways that Duran conceptualizes the relation between the grammar of biblical Hebrew and the verses of the written Torah. The first way, and I hand out this as A, I call it evidential, sees the verses as a database, the evidence from which we hypothesize the rules of the grammar. So on this idea, right, the grammar is the linguist's, the grammarian's theory of the data, namely the verses. Sometimes Duran describes the relation between the grammar and the Torah in exactly these terms. So for example, in 8, he says that because our knowledge of Hebrew has been lost due to exile and persecution, he says we have to infer the principles that ought to be prior from the facts that ought to be posterior. So the inference has to go the wrong way from the facts. Authors of the science of the Hebrew language rest their claims and bring proof that the rules they posit from what's found written in the Hebrew books. And this is the method and way of proof practice in the science of the Hebrew language, right? And he has a whole chapter, in fact, on discovery procedures, how to hypothesize, say, roots, given the data of the verbs, all right, in the Torah. But the second, and I think more important way, is B, which is to conceive of the grammar-Torah relation, I call this generatively, rather than evidentially. On this conception, a grammar is not the linguist or grammarian's theory or manual of rules to explain the data. Instead, Duran writes in 9, there's a remarkable passage. When the speech, Dibor, agrees with the rules, cherche of the language and its principles, we say that that statement is grammatical. We say of the speaker who speaks thus by nature and continuously that he is grammatical, the and of the faculty, koach, the power with which he speaks in this way, that it is grammar, titu. So here, the grammar is a speaker's mental faculty or mental power from which his speech is generated. As a mental power, a grammar is a potentiality that's actualized in the sentences or strings that the speaker produces orally or in writing. In other words, a speaker who knows the rules of her mental grammar for a language, if so facto knows the well-formed linguistic structures, the sentences generated by those rules. The well-formed sentences are right, generated by those rules. By producing and comprehending the well-formed sentences and other phrases of a language, a speaker manifests her knowledge of the grammar, her grammatical competence, all right, that generates that language. So the aseh Efod itself is the grammarian Duran's explicit theoretical representation of the biblical Hebrew speaker's mental faculty. Now, with live natural languages, the language generated by the speaker's grammar are his utterances producing the full range of speech behavior, everyday activities. But with an ancient language like biblical Hebrew, the linguistic corpus that's generated by its ancient speakers' grammar that's also available to Duran and to us are not novel utterances produced in a live language. Rather, for these languages like biblical Hebrew, The speech or linguistic output of their speaker's grammar faculty is to be found in the written or memorized texts we possess composed in those languages. So the speech generated by the grammar of the ancient biblical Hebrew speaker that's available to Duran and to us is identical to the corpus of verses found in the Hebrew Bible, the written Torah. That text is the output of its ancient speaker's mental grammar, the biblical Hebrew language that's also available to us. And in turn, we can manifest our own linguistic mastery of biblical Hebrew and of its grammar by reciting and thinking out those verses and by understanding them according to their lexical and grammatical meaning, syntax, and phonetics. This comes as close as one can at present to being a live speaker of biblical Hebrew. The verses of the Torah are not merely evidence for hypothesizing a grammar of ancient Hebrew, they are the ancient Hebrew language generated by the ancient Hebrew speaker's mental faculty, his grammar. This is the significance of the written Torah or Hebrew Bible for Duran, the grammarian. The written Torah is ancient biblical Hebrew. When he tells his reader to constantly keep the memorized Torah in mind, keep it in his heart, recite it, pronounce it, he's telling him, in other words, to engage with the verses of the Torah as if he were a live ancient Hebrew speaker, producing and speaking and thinking those strings generated by his own, Hebrew faculty, biblical Hebrew faculty, okay? When now is the skuma that Duran says attaches to the written Torah, cum ancient biblical Hebrew? Well, the essence of that language is its grammatical significance, the grammatical significance of the linguistic universal that it exemplifies. The three parts of speech, for example, okay? And that linguistic universal corresponds to, as explained by metaphysical reality, the different categories of beings. So the skuma of the written Torah, kun biblical Hebrew, lies precisely in our knowledge of those metaphysical realities. And that knowledge enables us to provide for ourselves, okay? Type of providence, right? But the structure of the skuma is still richer even than this. In addition to the three parts of speech, Duran points out parallel tripartite structures in the Hebrew Bible itself, which is divided in your handout. I list all these parallel tripartite divisions, which is divided into Torah, in other words, the Pentateuch, the prophets, and the writings. And these in turn correspond to three levels of prophecy, okay? And also, all right, to three precincts in the ancient temple in Jerusalem, all right, each of which had its own respective level of holiness and purity. From all of these tripartite structures, Duran concludes, and this is number 10, just as the temple was the cause for the constant presence of the Shekhinah, the divine presence among the Israelites, okay, this is the providence, so the written Torah is the proximate cause for the existence and survival of the Jewish nation through the skuma attached to it. So written Torah, your biblical Hebrew. Okay. For its sake, divine providence cares for the nation, and the more it reads it with the proper intention, which is the cause of its existence, survival, and happiness. So the skuma of the internalized written Torah now calls upon the resonances of all these tripartite structures. When one constantly speaks to oneself in one's mind, the written Torah, aka biblical Hebrew, one grasps the metaphysical reality that now mirrors and explains not only linguistic universals, but the tripartite structure of the temple, all right, and of the Bible itself. This skuma, its power to reveal metaphysical knowledge, okay, brings her to perfection and happiness. But not only happiness. And this is in number 11. The temple was the cause of God's atonement of the sins of the nation who had transgressed his commandments. So engagement with the sanctified book, that is the written Torah, with a desired intention, by memorizing it and by keeping it in one's heart, will be the cause for God to forgive the sins of the nation and its transgressions. In other words, the skuma brings about atonement and salvation. Now, this is a new piece in the story. And this one, we ought to remind you of Christianity. According to Pauline Christianity, faith, as opposed to outward works, acts, mitzvot, all right, grants one salvation, atonement, and ultimate beatitude. Okay, we said earlier that the interiorization, Duran's interiorization of the wisdom of the Torah creates this new converso Judaism for somebody who can outwardly perform the commandments. Insofar as he now extols keeping the Torah in mind over bodily performance of the commandments, like faith over outward works, Duran also now creates a Judaism in the image of Pauline Christianity. But even more than that, by equating the temple, right, the memorized written Torah in biblical Hebrew language, Duran replaces Christian faith in Christ by mastery of biblical Hebrew grammar, the power of the word. And now it's the speaker's knowledge of metaphysically transparent biblical Hebrew grammar manifest in the verses of the written Torah that's opposed to the external performance of the Mosaic commandments. Knowledge of language is what ensures the survival and salvation of Israel. One more implication. If God was the creator of biblical Hebrew language, then biblical Hebrew is God's own language. By interiorizing and by constantly having in mind that perfect biblical Hebrew language expressed in the written Torah, the human speaker has in his mind God's own language. And when she comes to understand its grammar and knows the metaphysical reality that corresponds to its linguistic universals, that speaker has achieved a kind of mastery of language not unlike God's own mastery, all right, as the creator of the language. The human speaker of biblical Hebrew imitates or approximates God himself. This is a unique, I think, and novel conception of the Metatio Dei. And until yesterday, I didn't think there was any higher estimation of the value of knowing Hebrew grammar in the history of Judaism, or knowing any grammar in the history of religion with Sanskrit. Okay. But this is also a decidedly Christian conception of God, of language, the word, and of the ultimate perfection and happiness. Now, there were some classical and medieval Jewish rabbinic thinkers who took Hebrew to be God's own language, but not Maimonides, okay, or anyone raised in this philosophical tradition, as was Duran. Just the opposite. Given Maimonidean opposition, there's nothing he's more opposed to than this, to divine corporealism and anthropomorphism, the claim that God speaks a language. To do that, for example, okay, let alone the Hebrew language, just smacks of idolatry. And in the guide, Maimonides unequivocally denies that God speaks or possesses a language or that he wrote anything. Okay. So from a Maimonidean perspective, Duran's high estimation of Hebrew as literally God's language, the language God speaks, is idolatrously high. Knowledge of the grammar of the Hebrew language may be enacted in the Metatio Dei, but the God Duran imitates is one shaped in the image of a human being. I think he gets who that is. Well, could this anti-Maimonidean theme in the direction of Christianity have been the final counter move, all right, in Duran's war against Rabbinic Judaism, the church's reaction, all right? Could the converso Honoratus de bona fide have convinced the Jew Efod, in words with which Duran must have been familiar, 12, that our theme is the word which gives life? Thanks.
Thank you, Josef. Really very engaging paper. We have about 20 minutes or so for discussion. I wanted to ask you, well, let's see. Raising your hand.
Over here, David.
You're in there, and I'm proud.
All right.
Well,
Go ahead. No, go ahead. I can say nothing.
well, really, thanks for this fascinating paper. I want to ask a question, which is kind of perhaps a bit anti-Maimonidean, because I'm a bit worried that perhaps we see this controversy, this battle on both sides, once against the Christians and once against the rabbis, kind of from two perhaps canonical view that is focused on Maimonides. So my question is whether we can identify other Jewish voices at the same time that may have been compatible with or congenial to these ideas. I think we have a tendency to kind of see rabbinic literature as the only literature and as the kind of the voice of Judaism. And if we look for more diversity among the Jews, because if I read this, it seems to me that that his kind of self-consciousness seems to be very Jewish. I mean, he talks about the care for the nation, and so and Sefer Yetzirah could perhaps be, and also even the Lashon HaKodesh, which I just looked at the grammar that you put around, where this very beautiful expression, הלשון העברי בהסכמתו לטבע הנמצא.
That's the metaphysics.
Yeah, but isn't this very close to Kabbalah? I mean, the Lashon Ivri was very prominent in Kabbalistic. So perhaps if we just
but the metaphysics, I understand. The metaphysics, though, is entirely Aristotelian. Okay, substance, accidents, all right, intelligible world, the spheres, all right, the sublunar world that goes in and goes out of existence. The attacks Kabbalah. That's one of the three, normative kinds of Chachmat Torah, wisdom of the Torah. And he attacks in the introduction, and his attack against Kabbalah is that, well, they don't even use reasoning of the arguments. How could they possibly be a Chachma, a wisdom, a science? Okay.
But weren't there other Jewish Aristotelians in Themistios and in this kind of way?
Well, I don't think he had any familiarity with Themistius. There's no references to Themistius. But he refers to various Jewish thinkers. I mean, Nachmanides definitely influences him. Halevi and the Kuzari influences him. The various grammarians, Timothy, all right. I mean, a whole slew of grammarians that that he mentioned.
Karaites?
I don't think. I don't think.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember. I don't remember any references to Karaites, but that may have been where he was a function of the Christian context, Christian world in which he lived. I don't know how many Karaites were in northern Spain at that time. I don't know, but I don't remember any references to Karaites. I mean, he hated the rabbi so much, he really thought he might have like Karaites, but he got it. I don't know of any mention of the Karaites. What?
No, he may just be in good Jewish company in fighting the rabbis. That's what I'm kind of trying to.
Well, I mean, when he's fighting the rabbis, I mean, what I was trying to focus on in the first part was that he's fighting rabbinic Judaism, which takes performance of the commandments to be the core of Judaism. Okay, and that one must meticulously, fulfill every commandment, and that the highest study of the Torah is the study of halacha, rabbinic law. Okay, that's your standard rabbinic, education. All right, and that's the standard, kind of scholarship you find in the rabbinic community. Okay, even at that time, especially in the second half of the 14th century. Okay, you do have Maimonideans, but they're more in Provence, not so much in Spain. He had contact with Crescus, all right, so that's anti-Aristotelian, all right, but he nonetheless embraces, all right, Aristotle. But you don't really find, so that's the crux of his opposition to rabbinic Judaism. I mean, there is this Maimonidean, you could call it rationalism. Science is extremely important. The only way to know God and all is through the study of the sciences and philosophy, right? That's very important to him. But that comes out of, that for him is not part of rabbinic Judaism, that it's a moral Torah. Whoever.
I was wondering if this really is rabbinic Judaism that he's attacking, because this description of Christianity as the religion where one is justified by faith, it's true that that's there at an early period, but I'm not sure that's so there in the 14th century. It comes back at Protestantism. It's one of the big things that the Protestants do is kind of say, hey, we can get this feature out of the very early period. And I've always understood 14th century Christianity as being every bit as performative interested as you're describing rabbinic Judaism. And so this could be just as much an attack on Christianity as he perceived it around him.
Or you don't find, I mean, I actually, I never read Kunala Goyi. That's his polemical attack on 14th century Christianity. It's not being true to the gospel, the historical gospel. I don't know whether he attacks there. I haven't seen any discussion of that attacking, Christian rights. I mean, the various, what do we call, transubstantiation. Sacraments. That I haven't seen. I haven't seen any. I wouldn't be surprised. Maybe in this polemical letter, he may talk about them as being irrational, right? Those rights, right? But Pauline faith, right, would be the Christian animal, the Christian counterpart to his attack on the commandments. In other words, Paul's attack, all right?
Yeah,
on
I'm not denying that that's there in Paul, but I am very skeptical that the 14th century Christians were reading Paul and that they were paying a lot of attention to that aspect of it. Because if you look at, how the 14th century church is working, it isn't talking about, never mind the works, let's be justified by faith. Sorry, you don't do the works, they burn you alive. It's not holy.
Yeah, but again, that would be, if he attacks the 14th century church for not being true to the gospel. By the gospels, he means, of course, including the Christians, right? Then, all right, he would take that, all right, to be the counterpart to his, written Torah, right, the memorization of the written Torah. So Paul then, in contrast to contemporary Christianity, 14th century Christianity, would be the real counterpart to him, and the Christian element of this theory. Are you finding what I'm replying to you?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But,
Yeah.
So, if I may just ask from the perspective of ignorance, was he aware of Islam at all? So because there is the same emphasis on the potency of the word.
Yeah.
Almost grammatical belief in, an almost mystical belief in that. And secondly, the Christian analogy is not perfect because that's a translation, that's a Latin bracket, right? So as opposed to the original word, the way he thinks about it.
Well, he talks about Greek and Latin. As far as Islam, he never mentions Islam. It's just not part of his will. At least as far as I know. I remember. Yeah.
We had a question over here, Alexander.
Thank you, no problem. So I've been touched by this at point 10, this like the language, the Hebrew language as the cause for the existence and survival of the Jewish nation. So I would like to ask if there any direct relation with the rebirth of the Hebrew language in the past century.
I don't know who you read Duran, right? I mean, this is calling for a rebirth of biblical, not modernity. I mean, that would be the worst.
Yeah.
Right? But it's calling in effect for a revival of biblical Hebrew. And that's what we should be studying. Okay, that's what we should be thinking about. And the metaphysics that it reveals, I mean, of course, you know, modern rebirth of the rebirth of modern Hebrew has nothing to do with metaphysics. Okay, but again, so few people have ever really looked at this text. I mean, it gets constantly referred to. People say, "Oh, this is the Sideratum for future research." Read the book, but very few people actually have read it.
Thank you. It was really fascinating. You said that he considered Hebrew to be some sort of a universal language, and therefore Torah is some sort of like the real religion, right? But as far as I know, Judaism never presented itself as a religion that was open to everybody. And so, do you think that by presenting Hebrew in the way, biblical Hebrew in the way that he is, as a converted, do you think he's sort of offering a new kind of Judaism that would be open, because this is the real language, this is the universal language, then thus it should be, or could be open, not as this like sort of small religion.
Well, he's offering it. He's trying to supplant Christianity,
Mhm.
which is the universal religion. You know, a missionizing, right, religion for all humanity. The gospel to go to everyone, and he's suggesting no, not the Gospels. I mean, biblical Hebrew
But
is
he's
what shows the universality of language, all right? And once you identify speaking biblical Hebrew, keeping it in mind, all right, with imitation of God, all right, then it becomes, all right, everyone's religion.
yeah, so he's not supplanting it with Judaism as he knew it, but as some sort of like, I don't know, Christian Judaism.
I'm saying, well, that this may be a kind of, I mean, you know, the universality of Judaism
Yeah.
on this view, then maybe another Christian influence.
But did you know Dante's De Vulgaria Eloquentia, in which he accepts the fact, I mean, no one's going to question his credentials as a Christian. He accepts the fact that that Hebrew is the original language and therefore the pure perfect language. It's not, it doesn't contradict his Christian belief.
I want to ask you something. I mean, there's so much that's interesting here. Let's put aside for a moment the Aristotelian inheritance, which is obviously there, and he's kind of Aristotelian in a way, I suppose. But what's so striking in terms of our themes here in this seminar, you know, there's first of all the division of the linguistic world into things that are entirely mental, and then other things which are external. And within that mental world, there's a grammar as a kind of potentiality for speaking the truth, especially if you could speak biblical Hebrew by internalizing the entire text to the point where you actually become that text. And having become that text, you're then also becoming something like this temple that he configures as a kind of grammar. So the temple itself was the kind of universal grammar that you know, that he's like describing on some other level. It's an astonishing statement about the relation between, let's call it, language and the real world.
Yeah.
And so much so also, with the emphasis on Hebrew and the originality of Hebrew, and then the human speaker is embodying all of this and becoming, in effect, like God himself. It strikes me as a kind of proto-Spinozan figure. I don't know how you would feel about that.
Well, Spinoza doesn't have language.
Yeah.
I mean, doesn't become the world. I mean, God isn't the world. It's
Right.
not pantheism, all right?
Yeah.
That's the metaphysical reality.
Right.
Okay, and knowledge of it is allowed to, you know, achieve happiness, all right? So I don't think there's Spinozistic. I mean, you know, Spinoza wrote a grammar. I don't think that Spinoza knew of Efod, as far as I know. I've
Yeah.
never-
No, I'm not saying that there's an affiliation. I just
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
a kind of strange adumbration. Also, the kind of potential monistic side of it. Which is,
Yeah, it's very nice.
yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I just want, you know, if the ultimate happiness is, you know, having the grammar in mind.
Yeah.
I mean, in paradise, I mean, eternally, happy
Exactly.
verbs.
What are we doing here?
You wonder what hell is.
Yeah, you remind me, there's a story among Indian languages, Punjabi is sometimes thought to be less mellifluous to the ear. And there's a story about a Punjabi speaker who was, he was studying Hindi. And when they asked him why he was studying Hindi, he said, well, Hindi is the language of the gods, right? I mean, if I know Hindi, I'll go straight to heaven. So then his interlocutor says to him, well, yeah, but what if you don't end up in heaven, but actually you end up in hell? And he said, well, actually, I already speak Punjabi. So, I think, and any, did you? Okay.
It's
Eitan,
very,
oh,
but very
sorry.
brief and
Yeah.
maybe very naive. So if the main claim is that language exemplifies the right metaphysics, but like the right metaphysics we already know about because we know about Aristotle, then could you just say a little bit more about why actually Hebrew is of value? I mean, we have the metaphysics independently of any language, right?
Yeah, if you didn't know the Aristotle, you wouldn't be able to see how Hebrew, biblical Hebrew exemplifies metaphysical reality. That's what you're suggesting. So then what value does knowing Hebrew add beyond knowing metaphysics? If you know the metaphysics directly.
Right, so is the idea to get other people who are not philosophers to know the right metaphysics? Is that the idea?
What I think,
Philosophers have access to
yeah,
metaphysics, right?
right.
Okay.
But it's sort of similar, I think. I mean, I think he never spells this out, but this may have been Maimonidean influence on him. Maimonides believed that philosophy was native, indigenous to the Israelites, okay, and the ancient Israelites and the ancient Jews. That is, not only did they have, were the prophets philosophers, all right, but you had in the ancient Israelite world all the schools of philosophy that correspond to the schools of philosophy that he knew in the 12th century. Okay. And so it was this indigenous knowledge of metaphysics. I think Duran probably believed something like that. Okay. That this knowledge of the biblical Hebrew, fully understanding the grammar, right? Being able to have causal explanations of the linguistic phenomena, that was their window into metaphysics. It's kind of a linguistic, metaphysics. Okay. I mean, I in preparing this talk, the Hebrew word, the Maimonidean term for metaphysics, not the Arabic term, right? Okay, right? But the Hebrew term aseh merkava, right? She identifies with Aristotle's metaphysics, all right? Maybe the source of maseh efod. In other words, this is his metaphysics, right? I mean, it's not clear. I mean, in the Torah, the Efod is called Maseh Hoshev, okay? So it also has a biblical source, all right? But I have a feeling that because of the role of metaphysics, that he may see this grammar itself as his metaphysics.
First of all, I want to thank you again. Take a 15-minute break, so we'll reconvene at 4:01. Okay. 3:01. Sorry, 3:01. Yes.
בעצם התשובה שלך, השאלה שבעצם, זאת אומרת, יש ערך לזה מכיוון שזה
חלק הראשוני.
אנחנו יודעים מה המטאפיזיקה, זה מה צריך את העברית, של תשובה לשאלה
כן, משהו כזה, אני חושב. אבל הוא כנראה מניח איזשהו תואר בין העברית המקראית, העתיקה, הפרימורדיאלית, לבין המציאות.
It's about inferiority, not that.
באמת אריסטו, זאת אומרת, ההבחנה הזאת זה בדיוק ההבחנה של אריסטו. לא שכל המדקדקים הדתיים.
אבל לא שלא יודעים.
לא, לא ספציפית של אריסטו. ההבחנה של הסלקי דיבר זה גם מאוחר. אני חושב שהחלוקה הראשונית היא משולשת, כי באמת הם מתייחדים. זה אריסטוטלי, זה גם בערבית, זה כל החאוס. כן, אני לא יודע, זה מעניין.
I'll get it from you. Yeah, but that's.
I haven't really kept up since.
It's sort of like, no, it's walking. It's sort of like acquiring a second language. Humming that second language speaking, right? I call that analogy. But that's, because it means, you know, it's mental faculty.
At the moment, I'm finishing
Yeah.
gigantic
It's hardwired in there.
almost done.
I remembered what I was interested in.
Yeah.
It has to do with this position, this very mental linguistic element of a non.
Yeah, the external ones, yeah.
I have to say a funny story. I was asked to invent a language some years ago by Francis Coppola, because he was making a film.
Oh, yeah.
About Italy, and he had it about this linguist.
This is what you're finishing, isn't it?
So you have the second word more in the poor linguistic case, but it's complicated.
Yeah,
And
so
so he ends up inventing a language that only he knows, and that's one diary entries into this language.
I have had to
So
do many things.
open a need for making him the language.
And one of
Yeah,
the-
And he somehow got me to win the contract. I invented this language and translated into my new language all these diary entries that were done beside me. Like, in the
And it was produced.
yeah, it was produced, not a very good film, it's a disappointing film actually, it's called Youth.
It's a really bizarre situation where,
But
you know, the book was all
interesting thing, I
finished,
could do whatever I want.
and then
So.
just around the time the copy editor gets to it,
so
so does the research assistant. Her job is
Only at mine.
every single word.
And actually did have real effects in the world.
All the words that I say are
Categorical.
where I say they are.
Yeah, Duran would have loved that language.
Oh, yeah,
If
yeah.
I get the date wrong,
Yeah.
I'll argue it. Shop.
Yeah. There are all kinds of nice sounds.
It's very, very
special.
She's finding mistakes, and every time she finds a mistake.
It would be a great
Pirates that I really
Stay
could argument on, then we argue it.
Those said the sentences were very complex, some of them
And
incredibly complex
I've
philosophical.
got an absolute final deadline at the 10th of June. for
You can see the film, if I may say so, I think they're like 3 minutes where they're like reciting my language, you know. It's the only interesting moments.
Yeah, because I realized.
But I had to
there are
record, I had to record
huge
it.
numbers of numbers. There are under 1,000.
And then there was a while,
There
few
are
nights when
thousands and
Coco
thousands
was
of
filming it.
words that
And,
are almost
so
long
he
words,
was
but should be
around
long words,
midnight,
but
it was
people
like
can write
10
long words. So there's
Say
a lot of
things like,
words that,
can you say anything you want?
code
in this
switches, so
language?
they occur once
That's you
or
can
twice.
something useful.
But they're not part of Greek, they're just the words that get
Anyway,
used. And
yeah.
then there are other words which
Well,
are not really.
he wasn't interested in the language. There are all kinds of other things I don't remember. I saved my notes on it. I'll have to read it.
papyrus is now being reread, it doesn't have the word.
Oh, wait.
So
And then
this
there
is
are
like-
words that belong to or there, but they're there in
Yeah.
antiquity. Papyrus has been redated.
Oh,
And now,
Phonetically,
obviously, where antiquity
we'll go
is.
get a copy.
Yeah, I just want to say
It's
great
in
thing.
antiquity,
Thank
but
you
I'm
so
ending
much.
it at
I
1638.
Yeah, really wonderful.
It's great. You gotta read
And
it.
that's
It's great.
the one that I can, where you guys
I
have this.
started.
And
Did you
so-
see the essay?
Then there were things
Did
that
we- did we
probably
just-
No, I
not
can put it in.
Oh,
If you want me to, I can send it.
And so the result is I've got about
yes,
5,000
it's a,
words
you
that
can
are
send it
back.
to Annamalai.
Okay.
That also have to go into my
I
giant
have it,
lexicon.
I read it,
You're
I read it twice,
So it's,
and, but it was very helpful to hear you speak it.
thank you.
Sure,
Well, I need
sure,
this
it's a
guy.
lot of,
But
I'll
I'll
wait
wait.
for
I'll
the-
wait.
I will.
there's a.
It was helpful to hear you speak it. I had read it twice, but
Was actually.
No, no, it's not very great. And it was very good to hear you. read,
Yes, I dare say, my mistake.
Yeah.
I mean, there's the issue.
And
too,
I
the
asked,
technical papyrus.
Papyrus,
I've got-
more.
I'm trying to get
The
every
sky.
annotation.
Will
No,
be
no,
happening
it's
to
a
you too. Yeah.
She's checking the papyrus.
So Christian after my-
No.
Especially the crescendo towards the end.
She's checking all the
Temple.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
can't
Something else, yeah, and that's the day.
because the epigraphy
Turning
is my
yourself into God.
No, it's really
do
interesting.
that myself, and then I spend time on one thing, but the literature is getting changed. I'm just
You
hoping
should
that I
get your
did it right
copy.
the first time. So. I know, I was careful, but I know there will be people who say that text, who said it was 2nd century, but it's not 4th century.
Inside the, people have also the reviews, right? Like, it's like a,
Yeah.
it's a collaborative work.
I mean, what I sometimes do now, there's a certain amount that one can do with the internet. And one thing that I sometimes do is post updated lists of propaganda on academia.edu. I do that for my textbooks, basically. And if people find ongoing mistakes, one thing I can do is do that for the lexicon as well. I certainly hope so. That's the idea.
Right, and this is really just.
Yeah, I mean, I think it will get outdated in the sense that more words will turn up, inscriptions will turn up, vocabulary will turn up. And there will be words where I said, this never occurred before the 4th century. And then
Sure, okay, but that's. I think it's mostly very skewed towards each other.
I mean, obviously there's certain kinds of information that turn up best in JIT, but one of the things that's interesting is that I've got more words that are attested in literature than I do that are attested in papyri.
Super interesting.
There are, the corpus of surviving literature is a lot bigger than the corpus of surviving documents. And so even though per sort of 1,000 words, we get 10 times as many loan words in the documents as you do in the literature, because you have a lot more than 10 times as much literature. The net result is still that there's a lot.
Are you going to talk about this?
No, I'm talking about the rise of atticism and the question of when, we saw analogy and anomaly as two versions of linguistic correctness. And in the time of Pharaoh and in the time of Aristarchus, nobody's talking about atticism. It's analogy, or maybe anomaly if you believe Pharaoh, but she says not to, and I personally agree not to. So what happens, what's the grammar war when atticism comes along? That's what I'm going to try to talk about.
not able to come to absolute everything.
That's the problem of being a home team,
Yeah,
isn't
right,
it?
of
You
course.
you don't get time off because you're away.
I was thinking about canceling.
No, I see this with every conference of people who are unlucky enough to be the home team.
Virtual conferences, it's all because I'm not able to just take up.
Yeah. Yeah, you better get your coffee quick in that case. You got 4 minutes. I am Wednesday morning.
It did, yeah. You have a lukewarm vertical consciousness. Yeah, that's awesome. I keep adding more to one. Yeah. Yeah. It hurts, so they're so still, they're like flexing out of the scratch. I was gonna just take a walk. Yeah, maybe we'll chat this. It's okay. I know, I was gonna try to drink a lot of water. But I can't see like. So. It is.
You're making me very nostalgic for my childhood Latin.
It seems like everyone here has had, most people here have had class in some way.
Right.
Every once in a while, on impulse, I try to read something. What I discovered to my astonishment is that the declensions, the concentration still exists somewhere in my mind. Like 50 years, that's yeah. And I love it.
So I have Sanskrit. I've always wanted to learn Sanskrit, but now it's something that's especially. I teach, sometimes in the Europeans program, with this teaching Italic languages. Obviously.
It's fun to learn Sanskrit. It's one of life's pleasures.
But it could take 12 years.
It could, yeah. It's just an understatement. Okay, there's handouts here. I hope everybody knows that I think 4 separate.
There's only one copy. Can you read it?
Why? Why should I do it?
Why not?
You can read everything.
That's good.
Yeah, it is.
It's beginning. Thursday. Okay, I think let's begin. Dr. Annamalai, please.
Friends, I'm happy to bring Tamil into the world of grammars around the world. Let me take you from Siberia to extreme South India, with some people believe as part of Lemuria. So,
Please try to speak a little
yeah,
louder.
as all of you know, that Tamil is a Dravidian language and considered to be representative of it in the sense that it has the oldest record of any Dravidian language. It also has a long grammatical tradition of about 2 millennia. In this paper, I present the historical relationship between the grammar of Sanskrit and the grammar of Tamil, and also the relationship between the Sanskrit grammatical tradition and the Tamil grammatical tradition. There has been a debate throughout the history, particularly in the commentatorial literature of Tamil grammar about this relationship. I would like to bring to attention 2 distinctive features of this relationship. One is even though Tamil and Sanskrit belong to 2 different families of languages, the debate is from the grammarians of Tamil, for whom Tamil is the first language and Sanskrit is the second language. There's no debate by Sanskrit grammarians whose first language is Sanskrit, because as far as I know, no Sanskrit grammarian was bilingual in Tamil, whereas almost all Tamil grammarians, to some extent, at least passively, was bilingual in Sanskrit. So there is an asymmetry in the discussion of who were involved, or who were the participants in this discussion. And the asymmetry comes from the asymmetrical bilingualism I just mentioned, and the asymmetrical bilingualism perhaps relates to the different status of Sanskrit and Tamil in terms of religion and literature and other areas. But this paper is not about the cause of asymmetrical bilingualism, but just to find out the fact that it is a debate within the Tamil community of those who have Tamil Sanskrit as a second language, and some of them have are proficient in Tamil. The other one is this 2000 years of interaction between Tamil grammarians and Sanskrit grammarians is not constant. It changed over a period of time. So if you broadly divide them into the earlier period, the classical period, the period and the Tamil grammatical tradition started, and the later period starting from the second millennium and and culminating in the 18th century, that the change is basically derives from the difference in language ideology. The ideology of Tamil as equal to Sanskrit at the earlier period, and the ideology of superiority of Sanskrit in the later period. We'll see some of it in the course of this paper. So I will focus on the factors of cultural and ideological and intellectual factors in talking about the relationship between Tamil grammar and Sanskrit grammar. Ideological relationship already I mentioned as a changing one. The cultural relationship goes with the term, Tamil term, marabu, which is marabu, which has a broader meaning, which includes convention and lineage and tradition. So the whole idea of Tamil tradition is to define it in terms of this marabu as representing Tamil. I'll come to say more about this tradition in a minute. Before that, I would like to point out that Tolkappiyam, which is the earliest Tamil grammar available, which etymologically means the ancient book or the first book, initiates this Tamil tradition, initiates in the sense of giving analytical framework as well as a meta language to talk about the Tamil grammar. The point I want to establish this is that this authority continued over 2 millennia among the Tamil grammarians, and I'll show how this happened. In the case of Panini, these Tamil grammarians, in the case of Sanskrit, these grammarians take Panini to be the authoritarian text for Sanskrit from the time Tamil came into contact with Sanskrit. So when you talk about the relation with Panini, the Tamil has a tendency not to refer to him by name or any other Sanskrit author, grammarian, but usually it would say that Vadanul, see, Vadanul in the sense a northern text. So it is a northern knowledge system which they are talking about, instead of talking about individual grammarian. So when the ideology, in the ideology, the Sanskrit and Tamil was equated as Sanskrit was called northern language, Tamil was called southern language. So that was an equation marking. So what we call competition, not exactly war, is the ideas between these two authorities, that is Tolkappiyam and Ashtadhyaya, Tolkappiyam, the author, and Panini. But this is not visualized throughout the history as exactly as a competition until the modern period, when Tamil nationalism took over and looked at this interaction as a domination of Sanskrit, domination in the sense that it takes away quote unquote purity of the Tamil tradition by bringing in the ideas from Sanskrit into the Tamil tradition. So the tradition is defined in terms of relationship between grammatical texts. Right? So whether any new book, grammatical book, remains within the Tamil tradition or outside the Tamil tradition would be looked at from the point of view of its relation to Tolkapiam, the first text, and then the other descendant texts from that. So the commentators make two kinds of text. One is called the Mudal Nul, that is a primary text, and Tolkapiam belongs that. And the other is Sargunul, which translates like dependent text. And then the third one is called Vali Nul, which translates like descendant text. Yeah, descendant text is closer to the original. It takes the ideological, analytical base of the original, but adds something new based on the changes which have taken place in the language, and also any ideas which might have come from other sources like Sanskrit. Whereas Sarbanol or the dependent text could be defined as having sharing a substantial part of the primary text, but also adding some new parts, new ideas about that. So the Tamil tradition, one can say that has been conservative in the sense that they tried to put any new work into this tradition, argue that it belonged to this tradition. This we will see when we come to the 18th century, where the Tamil grammar has been re-grammaticalized or retooled. Even then, it is considered to be coming by within the Tamil tradition. How they do it is by saying that we are just reinterpreting Tolkapiam. We are not countering Tolkapiam. Right? So it becomes a matter of interpreting the Ur text of Tamil tradition. The grammarians, of course, one of the commentators introduced a term which is in Tamil is Edirnol, which is a counter text, which would be outside the Tamil tradition. But as far as I know, no grammatical text, however different it is from Tolkapiam, is said to be a counter text. So they allow much flexibility within the Tamil tradition to accommodate the new text. One commentator of a later grammatical work called Nannul gives an analogy. He says that the Varinul, which is closer to the original, is the sun, and the Sargunul, which is less close to the original, is the son-in-law. Right? So the whole idea is that the Varinul inherits from the original, whereas the Sargunul is not so inheriting as a son. But still, you could see by this analogy that the Tamil tradition is looked at as an extended family. Right? That's why you allow other things coming in. The son-in-law becomes part of the family. Right? It doesn't become a separate family. So they discuss examples of whether an idea in a later work is part of Tamil tradition, or whether it goes counter to the Tamil tradition. I'll give some example from Sivanyana Muniva, who is grammarian, philosopher, and literature of the 18th century, who takes some examples of difference between Tolhapium and another work, Nannul, which comes after a millennium from Tolhapium, say whether Nannul, which means good or a desirable work. So I have given some terms in the handout because I thought some of these Tamil names and terms would be Greek and Latin to you, which is probably a wrong analogy with these scholars from Greek and Latin, but that's an English idiom. So the words you could look at that. So Nannul is considered to be a shortened version of Tolhapium, and it's a simpler version of Tolhapium. So I should point out that under Vadinol, the descendant work, you also include any condensation or elaboration of the Mudalmul, that is the original work. So in that way, Nannul would be considered condensation of Tolhapium, the original, the old text, because if you take the original text, it conceives grammar to be for interpreting literature. So that is the goal of the grammar. So any grammar would have three parts. One is about the sounds, the other is about the words, and the third is about, in Tamil, it's called Porul, which means the content, which would take all the literary content, including literary theory, etc. So the grammar is not for performing rituals, as some papers were pointed out. It was for interpreting literature. That was the goal of that. Whereas Nannul, which belongs to the 13th century after CE, comes at the time of the greater contact with Sanskrit, where the soul, the word, the structure of word is the most crucial component of the grammar. So the literature, for example, the poetics and prosody become a separate parts of that. So this is a major ideological shift about the conception of grammar. Right? Nannul does not believe or does not assume that the purpose of the grammar is to understand literature. Even then, it is considered to be part of the Tamil tradition. Not only that, it's a good representative of Tolhapium. So the question is, how do we understand what constitutes Tamil tradition? So I'll give just two examples from Sivajnana Munivar, whom I mentioned. One is about the number of letters in Tamil. Right? And Tolhapium says that there are 30 letters, consonants and vowels, and then 3 extra, not exactly letters in the sense that they don't have graphic symbols, but they are extra sound in the sense that they are shortened from the sounds of the alphabet letters. And the shortening takes place by the context of its presence in the syllabic structure, or it is in the context of a particular sandhi, right? Some phonetic change. It's not exactly allophone of modern linguistics, but these are contextually conditioned changes as 3. So the Tamil letters are 30 plus 3. Whereas Nannul, which also representative of Tamil tradition, has 30 plus 10, right? So 40 letters. how he arrives at 10 is instead of taking the syllabic structure as Tolhapian says, he takes a prosodic structure and says that in prosodic language, how the sounds change, and that comes to 10. He includes not only shortening of vowel, but also elongation of vowels in the prosodic language. So this is one difference which Sivajnana Munivar brings between Tolhapiam and Nanu. Other is from morphology. If you take first and second person pronoun I and you, in Tolhapiam, it is treated as a higher category. The Tamil grammar has three categories of nouns. One is higher category, which is generally human and divine also. And the second category is lower category, which includes animate things as well as inanimate things. And there is a third category, which is a mixed category, which could be both common to both the high category and the low category. So Tolhapia takes non as belonging to a high category, the human category, whereas Nannul takes non to belong to the mixed category. You will know why it's mixed if you know Panchadandra stories. I mean, animals speak. But the rationale he gives for that is in terms of in referential terms, right? The non could be used by humans as well as non-human, whereas Tolhapia's criterion for classifying this as a higher noun category is agreement of the predicate with the subject, right? So when you have non, you will have something like non-paditavan, with yan is a masculine, that I'm educated one. Paditavar would be a female, right? So the distinction of yan and el belong to the higher category, and therefore, even if the animals speak, they have to use only this, and therefore this belongs to the higher category. So one could argue that the first one about the number of letters as well as the gender classification of nouns are significant differences between the two. So how do you claim that Nannul is a Vardinul? It's a descendant word. And Sivajnana Muniva has a beautiful way of solving the problem. He introduces the concept of, in Tamil it's called Valu, which is error. Right? So a grammarian could make an erroneous analysis. So if you say that Nannul's analysis is erroneous, then it's still within the Tamil tradition. I mean, it's not challenging the Tolhapian tradition, but some grammarian, later grammarian, makes a erroneous analysis. As you know, this is very open-ended. You can bring anything into the Tamil tradition. So, what it means is that the meaning of the text in terms of content dependence or intellectual descent or counter theory with regard to text is not understood by mere empirical and quantitative fact, but rather by the conceptual framing of the grammatical problem. So it is from this point of view, you could see that Tamil has no counter text, right? Even a grammar text, which is completely re-grammaticalized in the model of Sanskrit, is still a Tamil tradition. How it is a Tamil tradition, the grammarians or commentators who came before them misunderstood Tolhapiam. They interpreted it differently. So the right way to interpret Tolhapiam is along the lines of Ponim, and therefore it doesn't deviate from the Tamil tradition. But still, one could show that there were two groups of grammarians and commentators who would draw more from Pawnini or other Sanskrit grammarians to justify an analysis, and those who draw less from Pawninian tradition. So they are known by the name Vadanularmadam, which means that the school of northern text, and then Tamil Nularmadam, the school of Tamil text. So there is a difference in degree of how much is drawn from the Sanskrit tradition. So the grammatical theory and analysis taken from Sanskrit grammarians was argued to be, as I said, in line with the Tamil grammatical tradition enunciated in Tolkapi. Therefore, there's no need to reject Tolkapi. So you can read Tolkapi in a way that it accommodates the later grammatical text. So this would have no prohibition about embracing ideas from Sanskrit tradition to the description of Tamil. When they say, whenever we see the resistance to Sanskrit idea would be that it's not in Tolkapi. It's not the view of Tolkapi. But what the commentators say is that this is not the intention of Tolkapi. You could interpret it in a different way, which would accommodate the new idea that came from Sanskrit. So the embrace of the Sanskrit model for grammatical description of Tamil could be selective or total. So my argument is that it was selective in the earlier period, and it is becoming closer to being total in the later time. There are very many reasons for it. The relationship, the development of Sanskrit as a cosmopolitan language and all those things play a role in it. But as I said, there's the language ideology also plays a role. Tamil beginning to accept the superiority of Sanskrit. We'll see later that superiority in two senses. One is knowledge. Sanskrit is the source of knowledge, and it's not very different from modern linguists in Tamil saying that English is the source, or Chomsky is the source of all linguistic knowledge, so we'll adapt him to describe Tamil. It's not very different from thinking of Pawnini or other Sanskrit tradition as a source of knowledge. That's one ideology. The other one is Sanskrit is a universal language, as you said about Hebrew. So being a Hebrew, being a universal language, grammar is universal. So it should be applicable to any language, and Tamil is no exception. So that is an ideological difference. First, I will explain what I mean by selective adaptation of ideas or analysis from Sanskrit. One is the example from the treatment of compounds. Compounds are a very favorite subject for all Indian grammarians and Sanskrit and Tamil. So you could see that the interaction between Sanskrit and Tamil in terms of analyzing compounds. And the Tamil grammar, particularly the Tolhapier's analysis is very selective in the sense that the Tamil compound system doesn't match exactly with the Sanskrit compound system, the number of compounds and what would be counted as a compound and all these things. And also from a theoretical point of view, as I mentioned in a comment on another paper, within Sanskrit as well as within Tamil, there are two theoretical debates about the compound. One is based on elision, that is, when two nouns come together, when the inflections are dropped, then there's an elision and that gives you a compound. The other one is when two nouns come together, they become one word, both phonetically as well as semantically. Semantic unity. So in that, I understand from Victor de Villa's work that Sanskrit grammarians have also accepted to the later view that semantic unity is primary and elision is a secondary operational one. The Tamil has, I could say, an advantage in the sense that the word for samaja in Tamil is tohai, which comes from the root tohu, which is homonymous or polysemous. Tohu could mean collect together. It also tohu means drop. So you could use it tohai to mean either one of the theory, but the one interpretation of Tolhopian is that he doesn't say explicitly, but from the way he has organized his sutras, you could say that he prefers the semantic unity theory of compound. And that is evidenced by what's called vinektohai. So this is the only compound with verb and noun in Tamil. Sanskrit did not have that samaja, but later on it accepts that. So the vinektohai, if you look at the actual text in Sangam areas Tamil, it's not a simple verb. So you would have the verb with its own object or location and things like that. So it is a syntactic string. So when it is a syntactic string, it cannot be a compound. Right? The compound is between two words. In spite of that, it is called tohai. It's called samaja or compound because the final element, the verb, and the noun which it modifies become one cohesive unit, irrespective of the syntactic relationship between the two. So, to quote Victor de Villa, he says that Panini says that the integrated meaning of compound derives from the claim that they have the meaning of their analytical equivalents, right? Two analytical equivalents, they become merged into one. The analytical equivalents of a compound may or may not have inflection in the words constituting them. Hence, elision will be superfluous to define some types of compound. If there is inflection, such a case suffix in the analytical equivalent, this suffix is elided in the compound to give them the nature of a unitary word defined by their grammatical behavior, such as plural formation. So elision is thus an operational indicator of the compound and not a definitional feature of it. elision is not universally true of all types of compound. This is about Sanskrit. But the elision theory is still holding a place in Tolhapia theory in the sense that when he talks about what he calls the verbal compound, he defines it as a verb which doesn't exhibit tense. And this is the tradition even now. They would say that when you have, I mean, it's something like waxing moon. I mean, in Tamil, it could be a verbal root and the noun, which is Vinektohai, which is the name for that. And the grammarians explain that the elision is a tense, so you could interpret it in the past tense, present tense, and future tense. So these two theories were in competition for a very long time. Maybe even now it is in competition. If you look at any Tamil grammar textbook, which is talk about elision, not about semantic integrity. So the another difference, as I said, is the number of compounds in Sanskrit and Tamil do not match. For example, Sanskrit has what's called adverbial compound and what's called numerical compound. Tamil doesn't have equal. As I said, Sanskrit did not have a verbal compound to begin with, but both Pawnini and grammarians have included some verbal compound. So he said that there was some interaction between the grammarians of the Tamil tradition and Sanskrit tradition. But because of the asymmetrical relationship between the two languages, the general view is that when there are some common element between Tamil grammar and Sanskrit grammar, it's always a one directional one. It came from Sanskrit to Tamil. But I think one could argue that there was more than that kind of worry. So another way Pawnini and Tolhapia differ in treatment of compound. Pawnini gives much more importance to compound than to Tolhapia. I mean, Pawnini has a large number of sutras discussing compound, whereas in Tolhapia, for some reason, the discussion of compound is in a chapter which in Tamil is Echavia, which is miscellany. Right? So it is pushed under miscellany. But more important difference is, unlike Pawnini, who is interested in generation of compounds, Tolhapia is interested more in ambiguity in compounds. That comes from his interest in literature, right? So the one feature of classical Tamil literature is not only in compound, even in syntax, the case suffixes are deleted. So it's the job of the commentator to see what is not present, and that's more so in compound. So he is concerned about ambiguity in compound. So this is you could see that there is a flow of ideas between the two at the same time. They also hold on to their own position, which come from the purpose of the grammar, as I said, that unlike Pawnini, Tolhapia is to interpret literature, and therefore his theory necessarily differs from Pawnini's theory. When you look at the the individual commentators of Tolhapium, they also differ in terms of the quantum of Paanini's ideas they take. I mean, Senavarar is one of the commentators of the 13th century of Tolhapium. He is credited to have been trained in the Sanskrit tradition, and he accepts more of Sanskrit grammatical idea. But this changes with a work called Virasorium, which belongs to the 11th century and which belongs to the period of Chola dynasty, which is noted for bringing in many Vedic ideas into Tamil culture. So this Virasorium, as I said earlier, only mentions Vadanul, even though he has adapted extensively from not only Paanini, but also post-Paanini and Paanini and grammarians. So the thing to be noted is the author of Virasorium is Uttamitra, which means friend of Buddhists or follower of Buddhism. He's a Buddhist, whereas Tolhapiam most probably was a Jain. Paanini is a Brahmin. I mean, that also has gives a historical antecedent of this grammarian. So the Victor de Villa says that Virasorium represents the Buddhist tradition of the second millennium, which is to take Sanskrit as a source of all knowledge. And they used the Sanskrit ideas in the description of Tamil grammar. So I would give one example from what we discussed in the earlier paper about the case. See, the Tolhapia's view, as I understand it, of the case is that case in Tamil is called Vetrumai, which means different, which is the same meaning like vibhakti in Sanskrit. So the purpose of the case marker is functional differentiation of one noun from another in terms of the predicate. And Tolhapia's theory simply lists certain kinds of predicates which would take certain kinds of cases. So it is a theory which is listing predicates which govern certain cases, which is given the name like first Vetrumai or first case, second case. But the first case refers to the subject case, and the second one the object case, and the third one is instrumental of that. So you could relate to certain grammatical function. And this grammatical function is used, referred to by Tolhapiam by the name Mudal, which means we already saw the Mudal Mudal Noun. That's the primary one. In this context, I would interpret, translate it as an antecedent. Right? So these nouns are antecedent for the predicate. So from this point of view, Tolhapiam does for every case he lists certain predicates. When these predicates are there, they will govern these things. I mean, this is a simple idea in the modern linguistic when you say that a verb which has transitivity will have direct object. But he goes further than that. Yeah, a verb which has this property, semantic property, will have instrument, or which will have recipient and things like that. So the names he gives for this function of the relationship between the noun and the predicate. He calls it Vechime Purur, which means case meaning. And then the declension is called Vechime Urubu. Urubu is a suffix, so it's a case of suffix. So when it comes to the first case, that is the nominative case, he doesn't list the verb as he does for the second object or indirect object, whatever. He simply lists a certain sentence types. You will have the nominative case when the verb is indicative, or when the verb is imperative, or when the verb is question and things like that. So it's only relating sentence types, but so that is because I think it makes common sense that the nominative case doesn't depend on the meaning of predicates, right, as other cases different. So there is a rationale for Tamil not having any case suffix for the nominative, but Sanskrit does have a suffix. So these grammarians, starting from Virasorium, try to find a case marker for nominative, simply for the reason Sanskrit has a nominative case. And Virasorium gives one case marker for the nominative, taking cue from the Paninian theory that the Karaka also has reflections on the verb morphology. So in Tamil, there is an agreement between the subject and the verb, masculine, feminine, etc. So he takes those agreement marker as the marker of the nominative case. So this is totally new, but as I said, this counts as a counter text of Tolhapi. So, so in my view, Tolhapi doesn't have much use for the other layer of case which Panini introduces in the name of Karaka, right, which is about the semantic relationship, not syntactic or grammatical relationship, but a semantic relationship between the nouns with reference to the verb. So if that is correct, then it is too much of these later grammarians to resist, to say that Tamil does not have Tamil grammar does not have a Karaka, because it's an important contribution of Panini. So they find many ways of introducing Karaka into Tamil. One way is with Senavar here, a commentator of Tolhapium, is, as I said, Vechime Purul used in Tolhapium is the relationship of governing a relationship between the predicate and the noun. So Vechime Purul, he says that the case meaning means the case causality. The word he uses is Vechime Purul is Vechime Karanam. Then he says Karanam eninum Karanam Karaham, sorry, Karanam eninum Karaham eninum Okum. Then he says Karanam, the cause of why a particular case occurs in a sentence is the Karaka. So that's how they reinterpret Tolhapium into mean the Karaka as understood by Panini. And also, formally also, as I said, they tried to find case markers for the nominative case. Virasorium finds one, that is the agreement marker, whereas Ilakana Kothi, which is in the 18th century grammar, finds three alternative case markers for the nominative. And to say it briefly, he gives some evidence for case markers of nominative in Tamil, all of which could be interpreted differently, not as a case marker, as for something different. But in order to justify his creation of case markers for the nominative case, which is not in Tolkapiam, as I said, which is not required by the way Tamil operates, he writes a sutra himself. I mean, the commentators don't write sutras, right? They interpret sutras. So he writes a sutra. The Tamil grammar has 3 or more case markers for the nominative case, right? So so this is, as I said, this is a change in the ideology of Sanskrit, about Sanskrit, that everything true of Sanskrit should be true of Tamil. Right? And the reason they give is, as I said earlier, the Sanskrit is an universal language, and Sanskrit is also a source of all knowledge, and therefore all knowledge there should be applicable to describe Tamil. Ilakanakottu, the author's name is Annamalai, also brings in another one. He tries to give not only this ideological understanding of Sanskrit as universal and knowledge, but also he tries to give empirical evidence from Tamil that, for example, the nominative has case markers. So what he does, if you look at his example, would be, I could say, I mean, it's too broad a brush, but I would say that he is using Sanskritized Tamil, which became common in later Tamil. So this is in Tamil. Right? So I would write a grammar for that. I mean, this is a very ticklish question, and languages are in contact, where a grammarian should eliminate the elements, grammatical elements that came from contact, they should be taken as part of the language. So he takes them as part of the language. But as I said, the more serious objection to his analysis would be to say that whatever he calls as a nominative case marker could be interpreted naturally in a different different way. So here, to give you a feel of the Ilakanakottu's thinking, line of thinking, I'm quoting one sutra from that work called Ilakanakottu. With a handout as a Tamil version, as well as translated version, as well as a transliterated, as well as translated version. For you to have some feeling of Tamil sound, I will read 2 or 3 lines from the sutra. And this sutra is in the section called Payiram, which is introduction, which etymologically means sailing of the boat. So this gives a guidance how the boat is going to move. So anyone who wants to read the text should know the direction of the wind blowing. Right? So for that, and also this is a particular sutra is part of what's called Avayadakam in Tamil and other Indian languages, which is the author of any work expresses his humility before the audience, before he starts that. So this is also a part of Avayadakam, but basically he gives in this sutra 10 aids, 10 equipment, which the reader should keep in mind to understand what he's saying or what he is saying. So there is a definite guideline for reading his work. Just read 2 or 3 lines. வடமொழி இலக்கணம் சில வகுத்து அறிந்து தொல்காப்பியத்திலும் தொல்காப்பியத்திலும் அருகி கிடந்ததை பெருக உழைத்தனர். This is the first 3 lines in here. And in my translation, which is in the handout, is I describe elaborately what is concise in Tolapia and in other ancient books. What is concise in his commentary? He wrote his own commentary. He says that there are fruits. Some fruits are obvious to your eye, and some are hidden behind the leaves. Right? So I'm bringing the fruits which are behind the leaves, which you don't see, and that's how he interprets Tolhapi. Right? So that's what the sutra means. I describe elaborately what is concise in Tolhapiam and other ancient books. Having known the grammar of Sanskrit and made selections from it, keep in mind that I haven't made any new rule in this book. He keeps on saying that I'm not making a new grammar. I'm just making the Tamil grammar more proper. So it doesn't become a counter text to Tolhapiam. There are only a few works in Tamil that follow the logic of Sanskrit language. He admits that if you take the Tamil literary work and the Tamil language is used, there are only few which has Sanskritized the language. The word he uses, where I have said logic, the Tamil word he uses nyayam. Nyayam has a meaning of logic, but also I think he means more than that. But there are many Tamil words that exhibit the logic of the Tamil language. So this is a factual statement. Starting with Tolhapiam, Tirukkural, and others, these are the prototypical works of Tamil. This book is meant for those who have expert knowledge of Tamil and also know some rules of the Sanskrit language. So the reader should have some idea of the Sanskrit language. If you ask me why there is no work that has Tamilness exclusively with no influence of Sanskrit. So he is answering a group which asks that why don't you write grammar for works of Tamil, which is exclusively Tamil, without the influence of Sanskrit. He goes on listing many of the technical terms of grammar, which are either translations, calls from Sanskrit, or just adaptation of Sanskrit terms. So this is true right from the period of Tolhapiam. So if you take Vetumai, you could take it as a Tamil term created by Tolhapiam, or it's a translation with Bhakti, which means the same thing. So what he is arguing is the whole meta language uses the Sanskrit term, then how can you claim that Tamil is a unique independent language? Nevertheless, the number of works in Tamil are limited. He admits that the number of texts in Tamil are limitless, but is any of them exclusively Tamil? I mean, he's talking about here the literature where you have the influence of different kinds, the poetic theory or language and everything. So this is the way he tries to justify the bringing Sanskrit grammar closer to the Tamil grammar is already reflecting an established fact that Tamil literary works have come closer to Sanskrit. So I'm saying the grammar. Even though he doesn't say so explicitly, I mean, that's an argument he has. Furthermore, any knowledgeable person will shy away from calling something a separate language when it has only 5 letters different from Sanskrit alphabet. So Tamil and Sanskrit differ in alphabet in terms of 5 letters. There are 5 letters in Tamil which are not in Sanskrit. So can you call Tamil as a separate language just because it differs from Sanskrit in 5 alphabets, 5 letters? This is taken by Tamil modern nationalists that this is debasing Tamil. And he is just surrendering to Sanskrit, but I read it differently. I mean, what he means is that since Sanskrit is a universal language, just because a language differs in 5 letters, you should have a different grammar. So you could adapt Sanskrit grammar to Tamil. Right? I too shy away. See, to make a claim that Tamil is a separate. I mean, he uses the word tani Tamil. I mean, that's a very loaded term in modern Tamil. I mean, tani Tamil is pure Tamil without any Sanskrit. But he doesn't use in that sense that autonomous language. Tamil is an autonomous language. It is it differs in certain respect from Sanskrit, which is a universal language. Right? So the universal grammar could be adapted to Tamil with some minor deviation. Keep in mind that grammar is same of the 2 languages, Sanskrit and Tamil. I mean, he makes an axiomatic statement, the grammars are same. Everyone knows the simple rules of Tamil. No one will understand the difficult rules even if I explain. Therefore, I state some rules that will be of use for describing Tamil. If some rule appears to be in contradiction with another rule in his grammar, take one of them as expressing the view of others. When he's, as I said, he is saying how to read my text. Right? So he says that if there's a contradiction, don't think that I'm a fool, but there's a reason for doing that. If I have repeated some information of grammar, take them to be explaining another grammatical fact with the same example. If I have stated some rules that do not fall under the known Tamil rules, take them to be rules of the Sanskrit grammar. And it won't be, from his point of view, rules of Sanskrit grammar. These are rules from a universal grammar. And therefore, it will be treated as a rule of the Tamil grammar. I have given the rules in 3 chapters. He explains his chapter in the book. 1 chapter on case, verb, and miscellaneous. If I have all these rules under the grammar of word, and I do not have any rule of the other 4 parts of the grammar, that is, here he follows the Sanskrit tradition. The word, the sabda, is the fundamental part of grammar, both the composition of words and sequencing of words to make sentences. And that is a crucial part of the grammar. I have not dealt with about sounds, the sound that make words, and also I have not talked about prosody. I have not talked about poetics. Right? So in that way, also theoretically, he aligns himself with what grammar is. If you do not understand any rule, even after reading it many times, you can think of our student. If you do not understand any rule, even after reading it many times, look for their actual use in Tulvapian, Tirukkural, and Tiruvaya. So he says, go to the language of these texts, where the uses will be there. Even when you do not find any use in these texts, you don't find examples in them, then these are the these are the works that reveal usages that reflect the rules of Sanskrit. So that's the only course you see you have to find for justification of the rules he made. So that gives you clearly his mindset, I mean, his approach to the Tamil, Tamil grammar is totally aligning with Sanskrit. At the same time, when you read his rules, he says that he's not deviating from Profyat. And the last point is that if you take the commentary of Virasorium, which I mentioned earlier, the commentator of that work, who was student of the author, tries to explain why Virasorium does not have a section on etymology. It's Sanskrit. And the interesting answer he gives is, as the treatises in Sanskrit are the mother or source to explain all the words in Tamil, all the explanatory practices there will apply here also. Tamil சொற்கெல்லாம் வடமூலை தாயாகி நிகழ்கின்றன அங்குள்ள வழக்கெல்லாம் இங்கு பெறும். So here, some people misunderstand it, that this is a statement about Sanskrit historically or genetically to be the mother of Tamil or all other languages. I don't think he means that. He means that Sanskrit gives derivational rules. Those derivational rules should apply to the derivation in Tamil. So you don't have to write separate derivational rules for Tamil. You just take the Sanskrit derivational rules and you will get some etymology. The reason I say this is that the word he uses is Tamil Sokkalam Vadanule Tayahi. So the mother of all Tamil words are Sanskrit texts. He doesn't say Sanskrit language. So he is talking about the intellectual resource of Sanskrit to explain derivation in Tamil or any language for that matter. So then finally, what it means is that to state it in a different way, these grammarians, the later grammarians, say that there is a Tamil grammatical tradition which is ethnic, but it is absorbed into the universal grammatical system described and expressed in Sanskrit. They don't deny that there is a Tamil tradition. It is one, but it is something like saying one grammar in many languages, right? And you have your own system for other reasons, not for exactly theoretical reasons. The intellectual conflict between the groups, as I said, that Sanskrit school and Tamil school is not expressed through open clashes or condemnation in the Tamil context. Tolkappiyam did not lose the status of a root text of the Tamil tradition, and there was no attempt to discredit it or to dilute its status over 2,000 years. This is in spite of the fact that the Sanskrit group changed Tamil grammar as initiated by Tolkappiyam. I mean, it's totally changed purely from a theoretical point of view by new concept taken from Sanskrit grammarians such as Panini, but not only from him. This is a war, if you want to call it. I wouldn't call it a war, which is ultimately about submersion of the identity and multiplicity of intellectual tradition relating to the study of grammar. But this war was fought under the camouflage of reinterpreting Tamil by searching for the universal truth of language through a single grammar, which is found in Sanskrit. Yeah, I think.
These two quick points.
Yeah.
And thank you for your talk. It inspired me to make two simple points. First of all, about compounds. One of the things you said was, in some cases, they're so fully elided that they really become a single lexical unit and no longer function as compounds. I think you said that.
Yeah.
So many examples come to mind. For example, the old cliche about Eskimos have how many, 1,000 words for snow, and we all know most of them are just compounds, something snow. But some of them among them probably are actually separate lexical units. You have to know the language to explain that. In Hebrew, we have smichut. And sometimes words are so fully naturalized as single utterance. Example comes to mind is Ben Adam. And even writers of fine literature today say ha Ben Adam. It's not perceived to be a mistake. It's just become one unit. If you say Ben Adam, it's not stupid. And think about the names of a lot of devices and appliances in English and French. Séchereau. Is there any sense of being a compound anymore? But sometimes these are distinguished not by markers, not by phonetic
Inflection.
word actual markers, but by tone of voice. But in English, if you want to say hairdryer, you say hairdryer, and a lot of non-native speakers when they say that, that's wrong. Or sometimes it could go either way. There might be something called a hair dryer, which is not the same thing as a hair dryer. So that's about compounds. Second point, very quick, about you said Talmud uses nominative markers where Sanskrit doesn't.
Sanskrit use.
The other way around.
Tamil doesn't use Sanskrit.
Okay,
does.
either way, since I don't know that. In Japanese and Korean, you have not nominative marker, but two different kinds. One which indicates the subject of a predicate, and one topic of an utterance. And those are very important. If you get it wrong in speaking these languages, you won't be stoned, but you'll raise eyebrows. So this is a whole big issue of topic structures we didn't get into today.
Yeah, that's true. Taking your second comment first, the Tamil grammarian's view is that the case markers are governed by the meaning of the predicate. When it comes to nominative, there is no selectivity in terms of what cases to take. That when you take the other cases, you could say the predicate X could take a direct object, and predicate Y could take a direct object and indirect object. But when it comes to nominative, you can then say that this predicate will not take nominative. So any predicate will take nominative, and therefore you don't have to link it with the choice of a particular case. The predicate, I think that is the theoretical basis for explaining why Tamil doesn't have the case marker. But going back to your first question, a compound could have many words, but it behaves like one word both semantically as well as in other grammatical properties. The example you give about the accent. So even if you have a compound of 3 words, the accent would follow as if it is on one word. So the stress pattern is of one word. Similarly, the meaning, when you say that the meaning of a compound is derived from the analytical part, it's true that it's put together, but it coheres into one meaning. So it is in this respect similar to idioms, right? We all know that idioms are like words. Their meaning is unitary. But compounds are not exactly idioms, but they are close to idioms in terms of their semantic integrity. At least that is their theoretical stand.
Yeah.
Well, actually, my question was precisely about these two theories of compounding that you mentioned, sir. And role of, we learned from David with the example of the two compounds Indra, Shatru, where one of them means the killer of Indra and the other means having Indra as the killer. The morphological feature that clearly distinguishes the two is not the elision of case endings, which is common to both of them, but the location of the high pitch accent in the resulting compound, where it occurs on only one syllable in the whole compound, and not necessarily, depending on the type of the compound, on a syllable in which it would occur in a separate word. So it appears that for Sanskrit, this fact would support the integration theory rather than the elision theory, although, you know, it's often ignored simply because the Vedic pitch accent has not been pronounced in Sanskrit for maybe 2,000 years. But I wanted to ask whether there's something else in Tamil, some other, because you mentioned among other morphological features, is there some other feature of accent or of anything else that distinguishes?
I don't think Tamil carries any accent. So accent cannot be a sort like English import both as a noun and verb. It's a different placement of action. So the only thing which goes for the theory of cohesion is when you add a plural marker, it will go to the both, so the both thing like that. There are some morphological factors, but at the same time, I should admit that there are some counterexamples. If you use a relative clause, it could modify the first part of the compound and the second part of the compound. It also exists. That's why this choice between cohesion and elision is an unsolved question, even in Sanskrit. I think that's the case in Tamil.
Professor, so I have a question about, so you said there was a move from selective to complete reliance on central access. So was this also the idea of, and was there any resistance to such a move later on? Because these texts clearly do not mind relying on Sanskrit or the acceptance of Sanskrit as universal. But when do we really see this change happening? Resistance to this idea that Sanskrit.
Yeah, I mean, this change, it could be attributed to the language geology starts from the second millennium, which is Virasolium, which is 11th century BC, but it goes on increasing. You see the peak in the 18th century, and there is no refutations of this in Tamil grammarian, but they wrote alternative grammar. So I mentioned about the Ilakana Kotha of the 18th century, which goes in the direction of Sanskrit. Whereas there is another work of the same century, Ilakana Virakam, the Light of Grammar, which is known as Zuniyatul, because that is believed to be preserved the Tolkapian tradition. So these two schools of thought, which they call S school for Sanskrit school and T school, Tamil school, existed side by side. But no school is pure in the sense that the Sanskrit school did not have all Sanskrit schools, and Tamil school had only Tamil root. So as I said, the commentators of the Tolkapian would differ in terms of how far they go in which direction. So there was more choice among the commentators and grammarians, and that might come from their language ideology, their conception of Sanskrit. So as I said, there is no counter text as far as I know. The only counted text which I know of is what was written by the Vijnana River of the 18th century, which is titled Ilakkana Vilakka Churavali. Ilakkana Vilakkam is a tempest of light of grammar, and he is a storm, which is putting out the light. So, I mean, basically, it again, what he says is that Ilakkana Vilakkam's interpretation of Tolhapiyam is wrong. He doesn't say Tolhapiyam is wrong.
Yeah.
So Ilakkana Vilakkam interprets Tolhapiyam wrongly. I interpret it rightly. And to my interpretation goes along with Pawnini's idea of Sanskrit.
Sorry, one more question. So this is about the compounds which are formed with words. You were saying that in Tamil it's with verbal roots. I have no knowledge of Tamil, so please correct me if I'm wrong. So there are very few Sanskrit compounds like David, which would be with a verbal root, or Kumbhakara, which are kind of like a mutation of the verbal root. So how do these comedians who are relying on the Ashtadhyayi or Panini's text, how do they then explain the Tamil compounds which have so many verbal roots, because Panini is just treating them as like these exceptions of the general category of Samaj.
Yeah, I think, I mean, my knowledge of Sanskrit is zero. So it's all from secondary sources. So they would take that some post-Paninians have admitted compound. So for them, that justifies. And then the Sanskrit school grammarians have rejected verbal compounds. It's very, very productive. Even common words like pickle in Tamil, which means soaking vegetable. So that is a Vinay plus, I mean, verb plus thing. I mean, even now you create new compounds using the verb. So it's a very productive one. And no grammarian, however much he wants to remodel Tamil grammar, could reject that this is not Tamil. But for their help, as I said, I don't know who, some post-Paninian grammarians have admitted. And Tamils could take pride that because of Tamil's influence.
It's possible that that's true, actually. It's a trivia.
It's a common.
That's
So you mentioned at the beginning of the talk that the Tolkapium has this built-in flexibility that has allowed it to be reinterpreted over time. And as a result, there aren't counter texts, but rather reinterpretations that apply the universality of Sanskrit grammar. My first question is, what exactly is distinctive of the Tolkapium that allowed for this flexibility? And my second question is, in the reinterpretations like the Nunbul and the Virsolium, you mentioned how they took concepts like compounds and cases and tried to apply them to the context. But I'm wondering, but in my knowledge of, my very, very limited knowledge of Tamil, I read a bit about the Grantha letters and the attempted assimilation of Sanskrit sounds. Do these new reinterpretations also attempt to discuss in any way new phonemes that were assimilated from Sanskrit? And if so, what is the significance of these?
See, relating to your first question, Tolhapia did not make his grammar intentionally flexible. That's what is Tamil grammar. But what the commentators do is say that, oh, this is an extra syllable, so this means what one means. And things like that. I think it's a good PhD topic to say how you interpret, so what you take as a clue to interpret the in a different way. Regarding the second question, yes, I mean, Tamil has some Grantha letters which originated to write Sanskrit using Tamil Grantha script. But any change in the spelling system of Tamil is only in terms of sequencing of vowels and consonants. I mean, Tamil has not changed its spelling over 2000 years, except the additional Grantha letter, which are still introduced for the children in school as a separate category. It's not part of the alphabet even now, after all these years of using Grantha letter. And Tolhapir is himself is quoted as there's a sutram in Tolhapir which says that when you write Sanskrit words in Tamil, avoid the Sanskrit sounds. That's the basic meaning of the sutra. And the ideological interpretation of the later scholars is that this is an ideological opposition of Sanskrit corrupting terms. But my interpretation is that he wants to avoid the sounds like that, ha, ha, which would destroy Tamil prosody, right? If I find new ways of accounting for these sounds in Tamil prosody. And my reason for that is that this, even though rule, many people call it a dictate of Tolhapian. So even now when I write Tamil, I should not use the Sanskrit sounding words or sounds from English like yaf and things like that. So even though this rule is very, very religiously followed by all literary texts until I think 13th or 14th century, Arnagirinatha, Bhakti poet, uses ja. So it's a very long tradition of that. But if you take the inscription literature of which is contemporary to Tamil literature, they are full of Grantha letters. I mean, it's all prophets. It's there. So this order is for poets, not for kings. And the poets, that's why I say that it's poets to keep their prosodic integrity rather than the integrity of Tamil.
I have to remember we have Sanskrit phonemes in colloquial Tamil, even more, there's more Sanskrit in colloquial Tamil than in Hindi, actually. And people pronounce things in the Tamil way.
If you take the spoken Tamil, if you go to village, it's all will be Tamilized.
Yeah, but
So it is mostly about the educated one. I mean, it's similar to the English pronunciation, right?
I'm always arguing with my Tamil friends when I tell them that they're using a particular word, it's a Sanskrit word, they'll deny it. They think it's a Sanskrit word. They think it's a Tamil word, a pure Tamil word.
Yeah. Say, for example, if you go to village, they won't say jati, but they say chadi.
Yeah.
And that's the case in Sri Lanka.
Yeah.
They use less of Sanskrit pronunciation, right?
We're going to have to stop in a moment.
Just one. So can we consider the Indian perception of case system is not just restricted to the relation that a noun has with a predicate, because apart from this nominative, we have the other like genitive case where it does not have any relation with the verb. We still consider it as a case. And the most strange is that we do have this vocative case where generally in linguistic terms, vocative stands outside the sentence, but vocative is also treated as a case. So can we consider, including as all these things, Indian conception would be any change that a noun takes, irrespective of the predicate with relation to the predicate or any other component. Any change that noun undergoes, they consider that as case.
Yeah. I mean, my view is also closer to you. See, instead of talking about the influence of Sanskrit on Tamil or vice versa, I would say that there was a pan-Indian tradition, intellectual tradition, which many streams participated. But that view is a minority view because Sanskrit is so dominant that it didn't allow any tributaries.
Did Baru have a paper called the Indian Linguistic Area? I think he makes a case for this.
Yeah, that is for words borrowed into Sanskrit, right?
South Asia.
South Asia.
I think he said India.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yamano's paper.
I just want to maybe conclude by two observations that apply not just to Annamalai's wonderful talk, but to all the talks that we heard today. all of them spoke about grammar that's being a kind of negotiation between parallel systems. Sumerian and Akkadian, Sanskrit and Chinese, Hebrew and Christian theologies and grammars, and Tamil and Sanskrit. So it's really important to remember that these systems are often a negotiation, and that the systems and their counter existence or their mutual existence leaves a lot of room for negotiation. Sometimes the other system is denied. Some other time it's accepted as a universal guide. Sometimes it's attacked. But it's a lot about the perception of and it's all and that there's also the question of what is perceived as reality and what is perceived as theory, because what we talked about today a lot, perception of compound theory, takes for granted that words are not theories, but a fact of reality. But words are just as much a theory as compounds are, and so there is a lot of room for negotiation there also, not just between systems, but between what is left for theory and what is taken to be a fact that is not. We shouldn't take that as a fact.
Like I would say that words are a fiction.
Exactly.
They don't exist actually. They're not. Okay. First of all, thank you, Dr. Annamalai. Directly to the room right next door to see this film, which I hope you like. I think you liked it. I also have to with introducing it. And I think we're starting right away.
Right.
Isn't that right? No.